I imagine a quiet studio somewhere in the city where the light falls soft through tall windows and the air smells faintly of cotton and ink and something else, something harder to name, like ambition or memory or the particular scent of fabric that has traveled a long way to arrive here. The room is filled with sketches, hundreds of them, pinned to walls and scattered across tables, each one a small world of lines and shadows, a suggestion of a sleeve, the fall of a hem, the way a collar might frame a face, and in the corner a dressmaker's mannequin stands draped in muslin, its form both present and absent, a body that has never breathed, yet somehow holds the shape of every body that might one day wear what is being dreamed into existence here. Outside, the streets hum with their own rhythm, people moving in waves, their clothing a language spoken without words, a conversation that has been unfolding for centuries, though most of them don't pause to consider it. The way a sleeve was cut this season versus last, the particular blue of a coat passing by, the shoes that announce an era, a mood, a moment in time. I find myself thinking about cloth, how it begins, perhaps in a field somewhere, under a sky wide and clean, where cotton grows in bowls that split open like secrets, or in the cool dim of a barn, where sheep are sheared and their wool falls away in thick clouds, or in the methodical work of silkworms, spinning their cocoons with a patience that defies understanding, thread after thread, building something precious from their own bodies. From there, the journey is long. The raw material travels, changes hands, moves through factories where it is carded and spun and woven, transformed from soft chaos into something with structure, with purpose, bolts of fabric rolling off looms in patterns that repeat or break or shimmer depending on the light, and all of this vast network of labor and craft and chemistry exists so that eventually someone might wear a dress to a party, or a suit to an office, or a pair of trousers while walking to the market on a Tuesday afternoon. But before that, before the wearing, there is the imagining, and this is where something strange and beautiful happens, where the industry becomes something more than logistics and production, where it touches on art, on identity, on the human need to be seen, to be transformed, to become, for a moment, someone else, or perhaps more fully ourselves. I think of the designers, the ones whose names we know, and the countless others whose names we don't, sitting in rooms like this one, trying to solve the impossible puzzle of how to make beauty functional, how to drape a body in a way that honors both the fabric and the person beneath it, how to predict what people will want to wear 6 months from now, a year from now, how to balance tradition with innovation, practicality with fantasy. There are drawers here filled with swatches, tiny squares of silk and linen and wool and synthetics whose names sound like the future, each one a possibility, a decision not yet made, and beside them, spools of thread in every color, and buttons, hundreds of buttons, bone and shell and plastic and brass, each one waiting to be chosen, to become part of the story. The light is shifting now, the afternoon settling into that particular quality of gold that makes everything softer. And I notice a book open on the table, its pages filled with photographs from decades past, women in gowns with waists impossibly small, men in coats with shoulders built wide, children dressed like miniature adults, and in each image the clothing tells a story about the time, about what was valued, what was possible, what was expected. Fashion, the word itself feels light, almost frivolous, but the industry behind it is vast, a global network employing millions, moving billions of dollars, shaping culture and being shaped by it in turn. It is commerce and creativity intertwined, a mirror held up to society, reflecting back our aspirations, our anxieties, our attempts to mark ourselves as belonging, or as different, or as both at once. And somewhere in all of this, in the space between the cotton field and the catwalk, between the factory floor and the closet, between the sketch and the garment hanging in a shop window, there is a history, deep and complex, woven through with threads of innovation and exploitation, artistry and assembly line, individual expression and mass production, a history that shapes what we wear, and therefore how we move through the world. The mannequin in the corner catches the light, its muslin draping falling in folds that suggest motion, even in stillness, and I find myself ready to follow the threads backward, to see where this all began, to understand how we arrived at this moment, in this studio, with these choices, this endless array of possibilities waiting to be worn. The story begins long before factories, long before runways or glossy magazines, long before the word fashion carried the weight it does now. It begins with necessity, with the simple human need for protection from cold, from sun, from the judgment of others. In the earliest days, clothing was purely functional, animal skins draped over shoulders, furs tied with sinew. Later, woven grasses and bark cloth in warmer climates, each garment a testament to survival, to ingenuity, to the slow accumulation of knowledge about which materials worked, which techniques held, which patterns allowed movement while keeping the body covered. But even then, even in those ancient times, something more than function crept in. Archaeologists have found evidence of decoration, beads sewn into leather 40,000 years ago, shells arranged in patterns, ochre dyes painting cloth in shades of red and yellow, as if from the very beginning. Humans understood that clothing could be more than protection. It could be communication, identity, art. The first great revolution came with weaving, sometime around 7,000 years ago, perhaps longer, in the Fertile Crescent where so much of civilization found its footing. People discovered that fibers could be interlaced, that threads running perpendicular could create something stronger than either thread alone, and suddenly the possibilities expanded. Patterns could emerge, colors could intersect, cloth could become complex. In ancient Egypt, linen ruled, made from flax that grew along the Nile. The fabric was light and breathable, perfect for the heat, and the Egyptians became masters of its production, their looms creating cloth so fine it was nearly transparent, reserved for priests and royalty, while coarser weaves clothed everyone else. Already, even then, clothing marked status, separated the powerful from the common, made visible the invisible hierarchies of society. The Greeks and Romans added their own innovations, the draped garment, togas and chitons, that required no cutting or sewing, just careful folding and pinning. The body itself became the mannequin, and the way fabric fell revealed something about the person beneath, their grace, their wealth, their understanding of how to move within the constraints of cloth. But perhaps the most transformative material in the history of clothing came from the East. Silk, discovered in China more than 4,000 years ago, according to legend, by an empress who noticed a cocoon falling into her tea, and as it unraveled in the hot liquid, she saw the thread, impossibly long, impossibly fine, and recognized its potential. The Chinese guarded the secret of silk production for centuries. It became more valuable than gold. Merchants traveled the Silk Road carrying bolts of shimmering fabric westward, and in return brought back stories of distant lands, spices, ideas. The trade in cloth became a trade in culture itself, and clothing began to carry not just individual identity, but the weight of empires, the exchange of civilizations. In medieval Europe, clothing became increasingly complex. The simple tunics of earlier centuries gave way to fitted garments. Tailoring emerged as a craft, the ability to cut a fabric in curved pieces and sew them together to follow the shape of the body. This required skill, mathematical understanding, an eye for proportion, and suddenly a new profession was born, the tailor, separate from the weaver, separate from the dyer, someone whose entire purpose was to transform flat cloth into three-dimensional form. Guilds formed in Paris, in London, in Florence, groups of craftspeople banding together to protect their techniques, to train apprentices, to maintain standards. A doublet made by a master tailor was a work of precision, every stitch placed with intention, every seam pressed flat, and the wealthy would commission dozens of garments, each one custom-made, fitted exactly to their body, their preferences, their station in life. Color, too, became increasingly important and increasingly expensive. Certain dyes were rare, Tyrian purple, made from thousands of sea snails crushed and processed, was so costly that it was reserved for royalty, hence the phrase "born to the purple," and sumptuary laws emerged, legal restrictions on who could wear what, peasants forbidden from silk, certain colors banned for all but the nobility, clothing policed by the state because it was understood, even then, that what we wear shapes how we're perceived, and perception is power. The Renaissance brought an explosion of creativity, of excess, of clothing as spectacle, sleeves slashed to show contrasting linings, ruffs that grew so large they required supportive wires, codpieces that announced masculinity with almost comic exaggeration, and women's gowns that used yards and yards of fabric, boned bodices that reshaped the body into an idealized form, farthingales that made skirts extend horizontally, creating a silhouette that was more architecture than anatomy. Portraits from this era show us the importance placed on dress, the detail with which artists rendered every fold of fabric, every jewel, every ribbon, because these elements mattered. They told the viewer who this person was, or who they wanted to be seen as, and the clothing often cost more than the painting itself. But all of this, all of these centuries of slow evolution, of handcraft and custom production, of guilds and individual artisans, was about to change dramatically, irrevocably, in ways that would transform not just clothing, but the entire structure of society. The shift began quietly in Britain in the late 1700s with a series of inventions that seemed modest at first. The flying shuttle, developed by John Kay in 1733, which allowed weavers to work faster, to produce wider cloth without needing two people at the loom, Then the spinning jenny, created by James Hargreaves in 1764, which let one person spin 8 threads at once, then 16, then more. These machines were resisted at first. Workers feared for their livelihoods. There were riots, machines destroyed, but the tide could not be turned back because the economic advantages were too great. Cloth that once took weeks to produce could now be made in days. And as production increased, prices fell. And as prices fell, demand grew, a feedback loop that accelerated with each passing year. Richard Arkwright built the first water-powered spinning mill in 1771, and suddenly production moved out of homes, away from the cottage industry where families worked together, carding and spinning and weaving as part of their domestic routine. Instead, workers traveled to factories, large buildings where dozens or hundreds of people labored in shifts, tending machines that ran on water power, later steam power, producing thread and cloth at a scale previously unimaginable. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, made cotton processing 50 times faster, and this, tragically, made cotton cultivation more profitable, which intensified the demand for enslaved labor in the American South. The fashion industry, even in its earliest industrial form, was already bound up with exploitation, with systems of oppression that valued profit over human dignity, a shadow that would follow the industry forward through the centuries. By the early 1800s, Britain was producing cotton cloth for the world, exporting to Europe, to the Americas, to India, which was particularly cruel because India had been producing fine cotton textiles for millennia. Muslin so delicate it was called woven air. But British colonial policies deliberately destroyed Indian textile production, breaking looms, cutting off thumbs of weavers, flooding the market with cheaper British goods, using political power to create economic dominance, fashion as a weapon of empire. In the cities, factories multiplied. Manchester became a center of cotton production, its air thick with lint and smoke, its rivers running with dyes, and people flooded in from the countryside, seeking work, cramming into tenements, laboring 16 hours a day in conditions that were dangerous, dehumanizing, children as young as 5 or 6 working in mills, their small fingers useful for clearing jammed machines, their lives valued less than the cloth they produced. Yet even as industrialization transformed production, clothing itself remained largely custom-made. The wealthy still commissioned garments from tailors and dressmakers, still had fittings, still expected clothing made specifically for their body. Ready-made clothing existed, but it was considered inferior, associated with poverty, with second-hand markets, with sailors and soldiers who needed standard-sized uniforms. This began to change in the mid-1800s, particularly in America, where a more democratic society and a growing middle class created demand for affordable, fashionable clothing that didn't require the expense of custom tailoring. Entrepreneurs saw the opportunity, began producing garments in standard sizes, using measurements taken from soldiers during the Civil War to establish sizing standards, though these standards were imperfect, based entirely on male bodies, and would create fitting problems that persist even today. The sewing machine, perfected by Isaac Singer in 1851, was the final piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, seams that took hours to stitch by hand could be completed in minutes, and factories could produce finished garments, not just cloth, shirts and trousers and dresses emerging from assembly lines where each worker performed one specific task, attaching a collar, setting a sleeve, hemming a skirt, the garment moving from station to station until it was complete. Department stores emerged in the mid to late 1800s, grand palaces of consumption, Au Bon Marché in Paris, Macy's in New York, Harrods in London, places where ready-made clothing hung on racks, waiting to be purchased, and shopping became a leisure activity, a form of entertainment, women spending afternoons browsing, trying on, imagining themselves transformed by the garments they might buy. And with mass production and mass consumption, the pace of fashion began to accelerate. Styles that once lasted decades now changed every few years, then every season, the industry discovering that obsolescence was profitable, that convincing people their perfectly functional clothing was out of date, unfashionable, embarrassing, would drive them back to stores, back to purchases, back into the cycle of buying and discarding that would only intensify as the decades progressed. The turn of the 20th century brought a new figure into focus, the fashion designer as celebrity, as artist, as dictator of taste. And no one embodied this more completely than Charles Frederick Worth, an Englishman working in Paris, who in the 1860s began signing his garments, putting labels inside dresses that bore his name, transforming himself from a craftsman serving clients into a creator whose vision clients paid to wear. Worth revolutionized the relationship between maker and wearer. Before him, women brought fabric and ideas to dressmakers who executed their wishes, but Worth insisted on control. He decided what his clients would wear, presented them with designs they could accept or reject, but not alter, and the wealthy, surprisingly, submitted to this, perhaps because being dressed by Worth conferred status, proved taste, demonstrated membership in an exclusive club of those who could afford his prices and his arrogance. Paris became the undisputed capital of fashion, the place where styles were born and then radiated outward, to London, to New York, to every corner where people cared about being current, being modern, being in step with the times. French couture houses established the rhythm of the fashion calendar, showing collections twice a year, spring, summer, and autumn-winter, a schedule that the industry still follows more than a century later. The early 1900s saw the rise of Paul Poiret, a designer who liberated women from corsets, or claimed to, replacing the S-shaped silhouette of the Victorian era with flowing, Eastern-inspired designs, harem pants and kimono sleeves and turbans that scandalized some and thrilled others. He threw lavish parties, marketed perfume under his name, understood that fashion was theater, spectacle, a performance that extended beyond the garments themselves. But it was Coco Chanel who truly transformed women's clothing, making it modern in a way that feels contemporary even now. She started with hats, then expanded to clothing, creating designs that were simple, comfortable, elegant. She championed jersey, a fabric previously used for men's underwear, turning it into daywear for women. She introduced the little black dress, which Vogue called the Ford of fashion, democratic, versatile, attainable. Chanel understood something essential, that women's lives were changing, that they were working, driving cars, living more active lives, and that their clothing needed to change too. Her designs allowed movement, eliminated fuss, stripped away the excessive ornamentation that had dominated previous decades, and in doing so, she created a template that designers would return to again and again. The idea that less could be more, that simplicity was its own kind of luxury. The 1920s saw fashion accelerate. Hemlines rose, waistlines dropped. The flapper silhouette emerged, boyish and free, women cutting their hair short, binding their breasts, rejecting the curves and constraints that had defined femininity for so long. It was rebellion through clothing, a visible rejection of Victorian values, and it was powered by a growing ready-to-wear industry that made fashionable clothing accessible to more people than ever before. In America, the garment industry centered in New York, particularly in a neighborhood that came to be called the Garment District. Blocks and blocks of factories and showrooms and fabric stores, and the workers, mostly immigrants, mostly women, mostly Jewish and Italian, sitting at sewing machines in crowded rooms, piecework paid by the item, pressure to work faster, always faster, to meet the demands of an industry that consumed labor as efficiently as it consumed fabric. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 had exposed the brutal conditions. 146 workers dead, most of them young women, doors locked from the outside to prevent theft, no fire escapes, bodies falling from windows 9 stories up, and in the aftermath, reforms, new safety laws, the growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. But the fundamental economics remained. Fashion demanded cheap labor, and cheap labor demanded exploitation. The 1930s brought the Depression, and with it a strange contradiction, Hollywood glamour at its peak. Movies showing women in satin gowns and fur stoles, creating fantasies of wealth and beauty, even as breadlines stretched around blocks. Designers like Elsa Schiaparelli collaborated with surrealist artists, creating garments with lobster prints and shoe-shaped hats. Fashion as art, as provocation, as escape from the grimness of economic reality. World War II changed everything. Rationing limited fabric. Governments issued regulations about hem lengths and pocket numbers. The fashion industry mobilized for war production, making uniforms instead of evening gowns, parachutes instead of petticoats, and women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, wearing practical clothing, trousers and coveralls, Rosie the Riveter in her denim and bandana, becoming an icon of capable femininity that had nothing to do with traditional fashion. Christian Dior's new look in 1947 was a response to austerity, a spectacular rejection of wartime practicality, waists cinched tight, skirts using yards and yards of fabric, a return to overt femininity that some celebrated and others condemned as regressive, but it sold, it captured something people wanted, a sense that deprivation was over, that abundance and beauty and frivolity were possible again. The 1950s saw the rise of teenagers as a distinct market, youth culture with its own styles, its own icons. James Dean in a white t-shirt and jeans, Marlon Brando in a leather jacket. These garments borrowed from workwear, from military uniforms, but stripped of their original context and worn as rebellion, as refusal to dress like one's parents. The beginning of a youth-driven fashion cycle that would only intensify in coming decades. In Paris, the haute couture houses continued their twice-yearly shows, elaborate presentations where models walked through salons filled with wealthy clients and fashion journalists, each garment made by hand, requiring hundreds of hours of work, embroidery and beading and draping that could only be done by the most skilled artisans, the petites mains, the little hands, mostly women, often working in cramped ateliers, their names unknown even as their work graced the world's most famous bodies. But even haute couture was changing. Designers began licensing their names. Christian Dior perfume, Chanel handbags, stockings and scarves and accessories that bore designer labels but were manufactured at scale. This democratization of luxury, or simulation of luxury, created a new revenue stream, allowing couture houses to survive even as the number of clients who could afford custom-made clothing dwindled. The 1960s exploded with change. Youth culture, dominant now, London rivaling Paris, Mary Quant and the miniskirt, Biba's affordable boutique clothing, models like Twiggy becoming more famous than the designers whose clothes they wore, and from Paris, André Courrèges and Pierre Cardin sending models down runways in white, go-go boots and space-age dresses. Fashion, looking forward, imagining a future of geometric shapes and synthetic fabrics, youth and modernity, and the sense that everything old was being swept away. This was also when fashion became truly global, not just Western styles exported to the rest of the world, but designers drawing inspiration from everywhere. Yves Saint Laurent's African collection, his Chinese collection, borrowing motifs and silhouettes and textiles from cultures that had rarely been acknowledged in high fashion. Though the question of appreciation versus appropriation, of respect versus exploitation, was rarely asked. The dominant culture simply took what it wanted and called it inspiration. The manufacturing base was shifting too, production moving away from New York and Paris to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, to South Korea, places where labor was cheaper, regulations fewer. Factory owners could produce garments at a fraction of Western costs and ship them back to be sold at prices that undercut domestic production. American and European garment workers watched their jobs disappear, factories closing, the industry that had employed millions contracting to a fraction of its former size. In the 1970s, fashion splintered, no single dominant style but rather a proliferation of tribes, hippies in flowing prints and embroidered denim, punks in torn clothing and safety pins, disco devotees in polyester and platform shoes, businesswomen in power suits with padded shoulders, each group signaling identity through dress, fashion as language, as membership, as refusal, the industry learning to cater to multiple markets simultaneously to feed the appetite for differentiation that drove consumption. Designers became brands, Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Giorgio Armani, names that appeared not just on clothing labels, but in advertising campaigns, on billboards, in magazines. Fashion photography elevated to art. Bruce Weber and Richard Avedon and Helmut Newton creating images that sold not just garments but lifestyles, fantasies. The idea that buying the right jeans or jacket could transform you into the person in the photograph. Beautiful, confident, desired. The 1980s saw the rise of the supermodel. Women whose faces and bodies became globally recognized. Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, who famously said she wouldn't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. These women had power the mannequins of earlier decades never possessed. They negotiated, demanded, became celebrities in their own right, and their presence at fashion shows and in campaigns could make or break a designer's collection. Japanese designers arrived in Paris and upended expectations. Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, Yoji Yamamoto, Issey Miyake, showing garments that were avant-garde, conceptual, often black, often asymmetrical, often challenging Western ideas of beauty and proportion and finish. Critics initially reacted with confusion, sometimes hostility, but their influence was profound, expanding the vocabulary of what fashion could be, what it could express, how far it could push beyond conventional prettiness. Meanwhile, the engine of fast fashion was warming up, though that term didn't exist yet. Companies like Benetton and Gap and later Zara and H&M perfecting systems of rapid production, trend spotting, quick turnaround. They could see a style on a runway and have a similar garment in stores within weeks at a price point that made it accessible to almost anyone. Democracy in action or the death of originality, depending on your perspective. The 1990s brought a new aesthetic, grunge, anti-fashion as fashion. Marc Jacobs sending models down the runway in flannel shirts and combat boots, fashion borrowed from thrift stores and street style, from Seattle and the music scene that was defining a generation's disaffection. It was ironic. Rebellion commodified, sold back to the rebels at premium prices. The cycle of appropriation and commercialization that defined the industry's relationship with subcultures, but beneath the surface, beneath the runway shows and magazine spreads, something more fundamental was shifting. Globalization was accelerating, trade agreements opening borders, technology enabling communication and coordination across vast distances, and the fashion industry was transforming into something truly planetary. Design in New York or Milan, fabric sourced from Turkey or China, garments assembled in Bangladesh or Vietnam, then shipped worldwide, a supply chain stretching across continents, invisible to the consumer holding a finished dress in a store. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 exposed vulnerabilities in this system, currencies collapsing, factories closing overnight, workers who had depended on garment manufacturing suddenly jobless, and the industry simply shifted, moving production to the next cheapest location, Cambodia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, always chasing lower costs, always willing to abandon workers and communities when profit margins demanded it. In the late 90s and early 2000s, fashion accelerated further. What had been 2 seasons became 4, then 6, then a constant churn of new arrivals, stores like Zara restocking twice a week, trends that lasted months now lasting weeks, the concept of the micro-seasons emerging, and with it, a new relationship to clothing, garments designed to be worn a few times and discarded, quality mattering less than novelty, than being current, than the dopamine hit of something new. The early 2000s also saw the rise of celebrity fashion lines, musicians and actors just lending their names to clothing collections, sometimes designing them, often just licensing their fame. Jennifer Lopez, P. Diddy, the Olsen twins, Paris Hilton, fame itself becoming a credential, a reason people might buy. The line between designer and celebrity blurring, collapsing entirely. Social media changed everything. First blogs, then Facebook and Twitter, then Instagram. Suddenly, fashion was no longer dictated from above, from editors and designers, but negotiated in real time. Street-style photographers capturing what people actually wore, influencers building audiences and monetizing their personal style, brands scrambling to keep up with conversations happening faster than traditional fashion cycles could accommodate. The 2008 financial crisis hit the luxury market hard, people cutting back, reevaluating their relationship to conspicuous consumption. But fast fashion barely faltered. If anything, it grew, offering affordable treats, little luxuries, $5 t-shirts and $10 dresses that provided the pleasure of newness without financial strain, even as the true cost, environmental, human, remained hidden. Around this time, the first serious questions about sustainability began to surface. Documentaries exposing factory conditions, the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, killing over 1,100 garment workers, the building crumbling because it was structurally unsound, safety violations ignored, and suddenly, briefly, the world paid attention, saw the cost of cheap fashion, the bodies behind the bargains. Brands pledged reforms, transparency initiatives, codes of conduct, but change was slow, difficult. The economic incentives pointed toward continued exploitation, toward environmental degradation, cotton farming using vast quantities of water and pesticides, textile dyeing, polluting rivers, synthetic fabrics shedding microplastics with every wash, the fashion industry revealed as the second most polluting industry globally, a staggering footprint for something as seemingly inconsequential as what we wear. Yet even as awareness grew, consumption continued to climb. The average person buying 60% more clothing in 2014 than they had in 2000, keeping garments half as long, closets overflowing even as people claimed to have nothing to wear. The psychological mechanisms of fashion, novelty seeking, identity construction, social comparison, proving more powerful than ethical concerns. The rise of athleisure in the 2010s represented another shift. The boundary between sportswear and everyday clothing dissolving, yoga pants worn to the grocery store, sneakers with everything, comfort trumping formality. Tech companies setting dress codes that rejected suits and ties, hoodies and jeans becoming acceptable in boardrooms, a casualization of dress that reflected changing attitudes about work, about hierarchy, about what professionalism looked like. Streetwear emerged as a dominant force. Brands like Supreme and Off-White commanding luxury prices for t-shirts and hoodies. Collaborations between high fashion houses and sneaker companies. Louis Vuitton and Supreme, Dior and Nike. The old boundaries between high and low fashion collapsing, or perhaps revealing that those boundaries had always been artificial, arbitrary, maintained only by the cultural agreement to pretend they mattered. Fashion weeks proliferated, no longer just Paris, Milan, London, New York, but also Lagos, Seoul, Mumbai, Shanghai, local designers finding audiences, challenging Western dominance, bringing different aesthetics, different cultural references, different body types and beauty standards, the conversation broadening, though power and resources still concentrated in traditional fashion capitals. The influence of K-pop and Korean beauty standards swept globally, a different ideal of femininity, a different approach to gender expression, boy bands in makeup and carefully constructed outfits influencing how young men everywhere thought about fashion, about self-presentation, about the possibilities of appearance. Another reminder that fashion is never just about clothing. It's about identity, about who we imagine we can be. Online shopping transformed retail. Why visit a store when you could browse infinite options from home? Try things on. Return what didn't work. Algorithms learning your preferences, suggesting items before you knew you wanted them, and physical retail struggled. Department stores closing, malls emptying, the death of brick and mortar proclaimed, though in reality it was a restructuring, high-end boutiques and discount retailers surviving while the middle collapsed. Rental and resale platforms emerged, Rent the Runway, The Real, Depop, Poshmark, ways to access luxury or vintage without full ownership, to cycle garments through multiple users. A response to both economic pressure and environmental awareness, though whether this truly reduced consumption or simply enabled more of it remained unclear. The pandemic of 2020 brought fashion to a halt. Shows canceled, factories closed, retail shuttered, people working from home in sweatpants. The whole elaborate system of seasonal collections and trend cycles suddenly irrelevant, and the industry faced questions it had avoided. Did we need this much clothing, this much change, this much stuff? Some brands didn't survive. Century-old department stores filing for bankruptcy, smaller labels folding, but the industry adapted. Digital fashion shows, clothing designed for video calls, waist-up professional, waist-down comfortable, and online shopping surged. Delivery trucks bringing packages to isolated homes, fashion as comfort, as distraction, as one of the few ways to mark time and change when every day felt identical. The conversation around diversity intensified. Models of color finally appearing in numbers that approached their actual representation in the population, plus-size models, older models, disabled models. The industry's narrow beauty standards challenged, expanded, though critics noted that diversity was often superficial. A few faces changed while power structures remained intact. Designers and executives still overwhelmingly white, still overwhelmingly thin, still making decisions about what bodies deserve to be clothed beautifully. Technology began infiltrating fashion in new ways. Three-dimensional printing of garments and accessories, smart fabrics that monitored health or changed color, virtual fashion for online avatars, NFTs of digital clothing selling for thousands. The line between physical and digital blurring. A generation growing up in games and virtual worlds wanting fashion for their digital selves just as much as their physical bodies. Sustainability became a marketing imperative, even if actual practices lagged. Every brand claiming eco-consciousness, organic cotton, recycled polyester, carbon neutrality, greenwashing rampant, the language of environmental responsibility deployed to sell more stuff, the fundamental contradiction rarely acknowledged that the most sustainable fashion is the clothing already in your closet, worn and repaired and worn again. Small designers and independent brands found new possibilities. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok allowing them to reach audiences directly, to build communities, to sell without gatekeepers. The democratization real this time, not mediated through department stores or fashion magazines, though algorithms replaced old gatekeepers with new ones, visibility granted or withheld by opaque systems optimizing for engagement over quality. gender fluidity in fashion gained ground. Brands launching genderless collections, runway shows featuring models of all gender expressions, clothing freed from the binary that had structured it for so long, though this too had precedent. Fashion had always allowed experimentation, always been a space where people could try on different identities. Perhaps what was new was the language to describe it, the permission to acknowledge what had always been true. The industry today stands at a crossroads, simultaneously more accessible and more exclusive than ever. Fast fashion, making trends available to everyone, even as luxury brands raise prices to maintain exclusivity, more diverse in representation, yet still deeply unequal in power, more aware of its environmental and social costs, yet seemingly unable to fundamentally change the systems that generate those costs. Fashion as contradiction, as aspiration and exploitation intertwined, as art and commerce in constant tension. And perhaps this has always been true, from the cotton fields worked by enslaved people to the contemporary factory in Bangladesh, from the Parisian atelier to the overflowing landfills, from the thrill of transformation to the waste it generates. Fashion contains multitudes, reflects our best impulses and our worst, our creativity and our greed, our desire for beauty and our willingness to ignore the price others pay for it. The deepening quiet of the studio returns, the light now softer, almost violet, and I find myself thinking about what fashion means beyond the garments themselves, beyond the industry's machinery, beyond production and consumption and the endless turning of trends. There is something profound in the act of dressing, the morning ritual of choosing what to wear, standing before a closet and deciding who you will be today, or who you need to be, or who you hope to become, the clothing a kind of armor or camouflage or invitation, depending on what the day requires. We are the only species that does this, that transforms our appearance deliberately, that uses external coverings not just for warmth but for meaning. A peacock's feathers are fixed. A chameleon's color change is involuntary, but we choose every day what signals to send, what story to tell about ourselves before we speak a word. And fashion, the industry, is both response to and driver of this fundamental human impulse. It offers us options, possibilities, the chance to align our exterior with some interior sense of self, or to experiment with being someone different, to try on identities the way we try on jackets, seeing how they fit, how they feel, whether they're true or just temporarily appealing. Think of a teenager getting dressed for the first day of school, the calculation in every choice, these shoes or those, this shirt or that, knowing that peers will read these signals, will make judgments, will decide based partly on clothing, whether to include or exclude, befriend or ignore. The stakes feel enormous, and in a way they are, because clothing does communicate, does shape how we're perceived, does open or close doors, or consider someone preparing for a job interview, selecting the outfit with care, conservative enough to signal seriousness, distinctive enough to be memorable, the costume for a performance where the role is competent, professional, worthy of hiring, the clothing a bridge between who they are and who the interviewer needs them to be. Fashion allows transformation, and humans have always been drawn to transformation, to the possibility of becoming more than we are. Fairy tales are full of it. the servant girl in a ball gown, the beast becoming a prince. Cinderella understood what the fashion industry knows, that changing your appearance can change your circumstances, that sometimes the costume makes the role real. But there's a shadow side to this, the pressure, the sense that you are inadequate as you are, that you need the right clothing to be acceptable, lovable, successful. The industry profits from insecurity, from the gap between who you are and who you think you should be. Every advertisement a reminder that you're not quite enough, but this purchase might help. The amount of clothing in the world is staggering if you tried to imagine it. All the garments hanging in all the closets, filling all the drawers, waiting in all the warehouses, stacked in all the stores. It would be incomprehensible. Billions upon billions of items, more clothing than could ever be worn, more than is needed, more than makes sense. And yet production continues, accelerates, the machine feeding itself. There's a word in Japanese, motai nai, that expresses regret over waste, a sense that throwing away something still useful is shameful, disrespectful to the object and the resources that created it. And I think of this in relation to fashion, to the garments worn once or twice and discarded, the intrinsic waste of a system that encourages buying more than we need, wearing less than we buy, disposing of what still has life in it. Yet there is also joy in fashion, real joy, the pleasure of a garment that fits perfectly, that makes you feel beautiful or powerful or simply comfortable, the delight of color and texture, the satisfaction of finding exactly the right thing. These experiences are real, valid, human. The industry may exploit them, but it didn't invent them. And there is artistry, genuine artistry, in the work of designers who push boundaries, who see clothing as sculpture, as commentary, as poetry made tangible. Alexander McQueen's shows were theater, philosophical inquiries into beauty and death and nature and technology rendered in fabric and form. Iris Van Herpen's garments that look like they grew rather than were made. Organic forms that challenge the boundary between body and dress, between nature and artifice. The craft, too, deserves recognition. The skills passed down through generations. The tailor who can feel by touch whether a seam is properly pressed. The embroiderer who can place thousands of beads in exact patterns. The pattern maker who can translate a sketch into pieces that will assemble into three-dimensional form. These are real talents, hard-won knowledge, worthy of respect even when the industry that employs them doesn't always show it. Fashion is paradox, simultaneously trivial and profound, superficial and deeply meaningful. It's an industry built on planned obsolescence that also preserves ancient crafts. It's democratizing and elitist, empowering and exploitative, creative and destructive. Perhaps this is why it fascinates, because it contains all these contradictions, reflects them back to us, asks us to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The clothes in museums are artifacts, evidence of how people lived, what they valued, how they moved through the world. A Victorian corset tells us about beauty standards, about gender, about the daily physical experience of being a woman of a certain class. A zoot suit speaks to jazz and rebellion and racial identity. A punk jacket covered in pins and patches is a manifesto, a rejection made visible. What will our era's clothing say to future observers? Fast fashion, athleisure, the collapse of formality, the rise of individualism, the anxiety about identity, the environmental crisis we generated, and then wore our way through. All of it legible in the garments we chose or were sold or settled for. The studio is almost dark now, the sketches on the wall becoming shadows, the mannequin in the corner just a silhouette. And I find myself thinking about the future, about where this industry goes from here, whether it can reform itself, whether we can find a way to satisfy the human desire for beauty and self-expression without the current costs, environmental, social, psychological. There are experiments, designers working with mycelium, with lab-grown leather, with fabrics that biodegrade, with production methods that don't poison rivers or exploit workers, small brands building different models, prioritizing craft over volume, longevity over trends. These exist, but they're marginal, swimming against a current that remains strong. Perhaps the change will come from consumers, from a critical mass deciding that enough is enough, that the pleasure of newness isn't worth the cost, that a closet full of cheap clothing is less satisfying than a smaller collection of well-made garments worn until they're worn out. But this requires resisting powerful forces, advertising, social media, the cultural messages that equate newness with goodness, that suggest we can buy our way to a better self, or perhaps technology will provide answers. Digital fashion reducing physical production, virtual try-ons eliminating returns, AI optimizing supply chains to reduce waste, though technology has a way of creating new problems even as it solves old ones. And the fundamental question remains, how much is enough? How much do we actually need? The mannequin stands patient, draped in its muslin, waiting for the next design, the next dream, the next attempt to make beauty tangible. And there's something moving in this, in the persistence, in the continued belief that what we wear matters, that we can create something lovely, something meaningful, even in the midst of all the industry's problems. Fashion is human, thoroughly human, in all its glory and failure, its creativity and waste, its beauty and ugliness. It reflects us back to ourselves, shows us our aspirations and our limitations, our capacity for making and for destroying, our desire to be seen and to belong, to stand out and to fit in, all the contradictory impulses that make us what we are. The room is quiet now, the city outside settling into evening, lights coming on in windows, people arriving home and changing out of the day's costume into something more comfortable. The daily transition, the moment when we can be ourselves, or whoever we are when no one is watching, when the clothes don't have to perform, don't have to signal, can just be fabric against skin, comfort, warmth, simplicity. I think of all the garments in the world tonight, being worn, being washed, being folded, being chosen for tomorrow, each one part of someone's story, each one carrying meaning or just filling a need, the vast web of thread and fabric and human intention that covers the planet, that has covered it for thousands of years, that will continue covering it in forms we can't yet imagine. And somewhere, in a studio like this one, someone is sketching, dreaming, trying to create something new, something beautiful, something that speaks to this moment, to the people we are now, to the world as it is, imperfect, changing, filled with possibility and constraint. And the work continues, the eternal human project of adorning ourselves, marking ourselves, making ourselves visible in the particular ways that feel true. The light fades to almost nothing, just the faintest glow remaining, and the studio breathes, patient, waiting, full of potential, full of thread and fabric and tools, ready for tomorrow's work, tomorrow's dreams, tomorrow's attempts to clothe the human form in something more than mere covering, in meaning, in beauty, in the endless conversation between who we are and who we wish to be. The sketches rest on their tables, the mannequin stands in shadow, and outside, the world continues its turning. People in every time zone dressing and undressing, choosing and discarding, wearing their identities on their backs, carrying forward this strange and necessary art, this industry, this obsession, this very human need to be both covered and revealed, protected and transformed, clothed and somehow, in the act of clothing, made more fully ourselves. I picture a landscape of mist and stone, where mountains rise like ancient sentinels above valleys wrapped in fog, and somewhere in the distance a single path winds upward through groves of pine and cryptomeria, their branches heavy with silence. The air here carries the scent of rain on cedar and wet earth, and something else, something harder to name. Perhaps it is the smell of iron, or the faint trace of camphor and lacquer drifting from structures hidden among the trees. There is a quality to this place that feels suspended, as though time moves differently here, where seasons pass in the turning of a leaf, the opening of a plum blossom, the first snow settling on a tiled roof. And in this slowness, in this patient unfolding, there exists a world shaped by ritual and precision, by codes older than memory, by the weight of a single word given and never forgotten. I find myself drawn to the image of a courtyard, swept clean of debris, the ground covered in fine gravel that has been raked into patterns, concentric rings that circle outward from nothing, or perhaps from everything. And at the edge of this courtyard stands a figure, still as the stones themselves, wrapped in layers of dark fabric that absorb the morning light. The figure does not move, and yet there is movement in the stillness, a kind of readiness, like a bowstring drawn but not yet released. And I wonder what it means to stand so completely present, to inhabit a single moment with such absolute attention that the moment itself seems to deepen, to open into something larger. Around this courtyard, beyond the immediate circle of raked gravel, there are buildings of wood and paper, their architecture spare and elegant, with roof lines that curve gently upward at the corners, as though lifting toward the sky, and through the open screens I can glimpse interiors of profound simplicity. Tatami mats aligned with perfect care, a single scroll hanging in an alcove, ink strokes forming characters that speak of wind or mountain or the way of heaven. This is a world where every object has been chosen, where every placement matters, where the distance between a tea bowl and its accompanying ladle has been considered with the same gravity one might bring to matters of life and death. And perhaps, in some way, I am only beginning to understand. These things are not separate. The arrangement of objects and the conduct of a life, both arising from the same source, both expressions of something essential. I think of hands, calloused and strong, wrapping the handle of something long and curved with braided cord, the movements practiced 10,000 times until they are no longer movements, but breathing, until the separation between intention and action dissolves completely, and what remains is a kind of dance, ancient and new in every execution. The mist begins to lift from the valley, revealing terraced fields below, their edges sharp and geometric against the wild forest, and I realize this landscape itself is a collaboration between human will and natural form, neither dominating the other, but existing in a tension that creates beauty, the way a blade edge holds its keenness through the meeting of opposing forces. There are stories woven into this land, into the very soil and stone, stories of loyalty tested beyond endurance, of codes that govern not just action, but thought itself, of a class of warriors who were also poets, calligraphers, practitioners of tea ceremony, who understood that the same mind that could end a life in a single stroke must also know the precise angle at which to arrange a flower, the exact moment to pour water over powdered tea. And as I stand here in imagination, feeling the weight of mist on my skin, hearing the distant sound of a temple bell rolling across the valley, I sense that I am approaching something profound, not through force or speed, but through patient observation, through allowing the details to accumulate slowly, like snow building on a pine branch, until the branch bends and releases and returns to its original shape. The figure in the courtyard has not moved, or perhaps has moved in ways too subtle for casual observation. A shift of weight, a breath taken and released, the slight adjustment of fingers around polished wood, and I understand that I am witnessing a kind of meditation, though no one would call it that, a practice of becoming so completely what one is meant to be, that the distinction between self and purpose vanishes like morning mist. This is where we begin, in a courtyard swept clean, in the moment before movement, in the space between breaths, where an entire world waits to unfold. The story begins long before the word itself existed, in a time when this archipelago of islands was still finding its shape, still learning what it would become, and the people who lived here were organizing themselves into clans and territories, each valley a world unto itself, each mountain pass a boundary between different ways of being. In those early centuries, perhaps around the 7th or 8th hundred years after the Common Era began, the imperial court in the capital city modeled itself on the great civilizations across the sea, adopting their writing, their Buddhism, their concepts of governance and cosmic order. But the reality of power was always more complex than the elegant documents suggested, because beyond the capital, in the provinces, other forces were gathering strength. The land itself demanded a certain kind of person, someone who could protect rice fields from raiders, who could organize the defense of a village, who could ride and fight in command. And so there emerged a class of mounted warriors, skilled with the bow, comfortable in armor, bound to local lords by ties of obligation and mutual need. And these warriors were called by various names in those early days, but the essential pattern was already forming: the exchange of loyalty for protection, of service for status, of life itself for honor. I see them in my mind, these early fighters, not yet the refined figures of later centuries, but rough men on sturdy horses, their armor made of small iron plates laced together with leather cord, their bows of laminated wood and bamboo, powerful enough to pierce armor at distance. And they lived in a world where Buddhist teachings about the impermanence of life coexisted with the immediate need to defend, to fight, to kill when necessary, the great families began to consolidate their power, the Fujiwara in the court, but also the Taira and the Minamoto, clans with military strength, with networks of loyal warriors spread across provinces. And as the imperial government's authority weakened in the outlying regions, these warrior families became the true holders of power, the ones who could actually enforce decisions, collect taxes, maintain order. There was a moment, sometime in the middle of the 12th century, when the tension between the Taira and Minamoto clans finally broke into open warfare, and this conflict, known as the Genpei War, would reshape everything, would establish patterns that would endure for centuries, would create legends that would be told and retold until they became inseparable from history itself. The battles were fought on horseback, with arrows flying in clouds, with individual warriors calling out their lineages before engaging in single combat. Because even in the midst of violence, there were rules. There were proper forms. There were ways of conducting oneself that mattered as much as victory. And these warriors kept records of their deeds, had their exploits recorded in scrolls, because reputation, the memory of courage and skill, was a kind of immortality. I think of the Battle of Dan no Ura, fought in the narrow straits between islands, where the Taira clan made their final stand, their ships surrounded, their cause already lost. And the stories tell of the child emperor, barely more than an infant, being carried into the waves by his grandmother, the sacred sword and jewel and mirror disappearing into the dark water. And this image, this moment of absolute defeat, transformed into something dignified and terrible, would echo through the centuries that followed. The Minamoto emerged victorious, and their leader, Yoritomo, established something new, a military government separate from the imperial court, based not in the ancient capital, but in the eastern town of Kamakura, far from the refined culture of courtiers and priests. And he took the title of shogun, the generalissimo, the one who held real power while the emperor remained a sacred figurehead, a source of legitimacy, but not authority. This was the beginning of the bakufu, the tent government, so called because it was originally the headquarters of an army in the field. And with this new structure came a new emphasis on the warrior and his code, on the bond between lord and retainer, on the idea that there was a proper way to live, a path that combined martial skill with moral cultivation. The warriors of Kamakura were expected to be austere, to practice Zen meditation, to cultivate indifference to hardship and death. And the stories from this period emphasize their simplicity, their directness, their disdain for the elaborate courtly culture of the old capital. They were men of action, of loyalty tested in battle, of oaths that could not be broken without losing everything that made life meaningful. And yet, even here, even in this martial culture, there was an appreciation for beauty, for the cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell in a handful of days, for poetry that captured a moment of awareness, for the way moonlight looked on snow, because the very impermanence of life, the knowledge that death could come at any moment, made these fleeting beauties more precious, more worthy of attention. The Mongols came in the 13th century, great fleets sent by Kublai Khan to demand submission, and the warriors of Japan met them on the beaches of Kyushu, fought them in ways the Mongols had not anticipated, and when storms destroyed the invasion fleets, the warriors saw the hand of divine protection, the kamikaze, the divine wind, and their sense of being a people set apart, chosen, defended by the gods themselves, grew stronger. But the cost of this defense was enormous. Warriors who had fought expected reward, expected grants of land, and the Bakufu could not provide what was expected because there were no new territories to distribute, no conquered lands to parcel out. And so the bonds began to strain. The system began to show its limitations. And in the confusion that followed, power fragmented. Provincial lords grew stronger. Central authority weakened. The country entered a period of near constant civil war, lasting more than a century, where alliances shifted like wind, where brother fought brother, where the old certainties dissolved. And yet, from this chaos, from this crucible of endless conflict, the warrior class refined itself, developed new skills, new strategies, new philosophies of combat and command. The castles grew larger, more sophisticated, no longer simple wooden fortifications, but massive structures of stone and wood, with multiple baileys and moats and walls, designed to withstand siege, to project power, to serve as administrative centers for domains that were becoming small kingdoms. And around these castles gathered not just warriors, but craftsmen, merchants, farmers, entire communities organized around the principle of service to the Lord. I see the training grounds where young men learned to use the spear, the sword, the bow, where they practiced in all weather, in rain and snow and summer heat, until their bodies knew the movements without thought, until they could respond to attack with the same immediacy as flinching from fire. And this training was not just physical but spiritual, a forging of character, a preparation for death that made life more vivid, more present. The tea ceremony began to take its classic form during this period, brought from Zen temples into warrior households, and what might seem like a strange pairing, the man trained to kill, learning to whisk powdered tea with perfect form, was actually deeply coherent, because both practices required the same quality of attention, the same elimination of wasted motion, the same commitment to doing one thing completely with total presence. There were codes being written down, guidelines for proper conduct, instructions on how a warrior should comport himself in various situations, and these codes emphasized loyalty above all. The bond between lord and retainer was sacred, was more important than life itself, and stories circulated of warriors who followed their lords into death, who refused to outlive their masters, who saw in this loyalty a kind of perfection, a way of transcending the merely personal. The swords were changing, too, becoming more than just weapons. The bladesmiths learned to fold steel, to create edges of extraordinary sharpness backed by softer metal that could absorb shock. And these swords were given names, were treasured as heirlooms, were believed to embody the spirit of their makers and wielders, and the way a warrior wore his swords, the angle, the wrapping of the handle, all of this communicated status and intention. By the time the 16th century arrived, the warfare had become more organized, larger armies, more use of infantry, of firearms imported from European traders, and yet the ideals remained. The sense that there was a proper way to fight, a code that elevated combat beyond mere survival, that made of violence something aesthetic, terrible and beautiful at once. The great unifiers were emerging, warlords who dreamed of bringing the whole country under single rule, who combined military genius with political acumen, who understood that power required not just force but legitimacy, ritual, the appearance of divine favor. And they gathered around them the finest warriors, men whose reputations were known across provinces, whose skills were legendary, whose loyalty had been tested in 100 battles. And still the cherry blossoms fell, and still the tea was whisked in quiet rooms, and still the moon rose over castle walls, and the warriors wrote poems about impermanence, about the beauty of a world where nothing lasts, where every moment is singular and unrepeatable, where death gives meaning to life by making it finite, precious, urgent. The unification came slowly, through decades of warfare and negotiation, through strategic marriages and calculated betrayals, and when Tokugawa Ieyasu finally emerged victorious at the great battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, he established a peace that would endure for more than 2.5 centuries, a peace enforced by the most sophisticated system of control ever devised in these islands. The new order required warriors to make a choice, to become retainers of established lords, to accept stipends of rice instead of controlling land directly, to move from their country holdings into castle towns where they could be watched, managed, kept busy with bureaucratic duties and ritual obligations. And in making this choice, in accepting this transformation, they became something new, something that had never quite existed before. They were called samurai now, a word that meant simply those who serve, and service became the defining characteristic of their existence. Not the freedom of the mounted warrior riding across open country, but the disciplined attendance at court, the mastery of etiquette, the ability to conduct oneself with perfect propriety in situations governed by rules of bewildering complexity. I imagine a morning in a castle town during this long peace, the sun rising over tiled roofs, smoke beginning to drift from cooking fires, and in the samurai quarter, the houses arranged in strict hierarchy, the higher-ranking warriors closest to the castle, the lower ranks further out. A man rises before dawn, performs his ablutions, sits in meditation, and then begins the day's training. The sword practice is not preparation for battle, because there are no battles anymore, but rather a form of spiritual cultivation. He moves through kata, prearranged forms that have been passed down through generations, each movement precise, each transition flowing into the next. And the goal is not to defeat an opponent, but to perfect the form itself, to embody the principle, to make of the body an instrument of pure expression, his swords. And he carries two now. The longer katana and the shorter wakizashi are works of art, the blades forged by masters whose names are known across the country. The curve designed not just for cutting, but for a kind of terrible beauty, the way the light moves along the edge, the hamon, the temper line where hard steel meets soft, visible as a wave of brightness, each blade unique, each one signed by its maker. After practice he bathes, changes into formal dress, and makes his way to the castle for the day's duties, which might involve nothing more than sitting in attendance while his lord conducts business, being present as a sign of respect and readiness, and the hours pass in stillness, in the careful observation of protocol, in the management of a self that must never show inappropriate emotion, never reveal weakness, never forget for a moment the weight of obligation. The castle itself is a world of coded meanings, the layout of rooms, the decoration of sliding doors, the placement of the dais where the Lord sits, all communicate hierarchy, power, the elaborate structure of a society organized into rigid classes. And to navigate this world requires knowledge, study, the ability to read situations with perfect accuracy, because a misstep here, a breach of etiquette, can mean disgrace, loss of position, the destruction of a family's standing. And yet within this formality there is room for arts, for the cultivation of sensibility. The samurai is expected to be literate, to know the classics of Chinese and Japanese literature, to compose poetry in the 31-syllable form called waka, to appreciate the tea ceremony, the arrangement of flowers, the hanging of scrolls, all the refined accomplishments that separate the cultured warrior from the mere fighter. The tea ceremony in particular becomes almost an obsession. Entire schools develop around different approaches to the preparation and serving of tea, and a samurai might spend years studying the proper way to enter a tea room, to appreciate the scroll in the alcove, to admire the tea bowl, to whisk the bright green powder into froth, and this elaborate ritual, performed in a small space, with movements reduced to their essence, becomes a meditation on simplicity, on the beauty of humble things, on the presence required to do one thing completely. I see the tea room, its entrance deliberately low so that everyone must bow to enter, regardless of rank, the interior bare, except for the alcove with its scroll and flower arrangement, the hearth where water heats in an iron kettle, and the host moving with choreographed precision, every gesture meaningful, every pause measured, creating a temporary world where normal hierarchies dissolve, where what matters is only this moment, this bowl of tea, this gathering that will never occur again in exactly this way. The culture of the sword becomes increasingly refined, but also increasingly divorced from actual combat, because there is no combat, just the study of technique, the preservation of schools, each with its secret teachings, its special methods passed only from master to chosen students, and warriors train obsessively in these techniques, even though they will almost certainly never use them, because the training itself is the point, the forging of character through discipline. There are stories that circulate, legends of master swordsmen, of duels fought on bridges or in temple grounds, of techniques so perfect they could cut through anything, of awareness so refined it could detect killing intent before movement. And these stories become part of the culture, models to aspire toward, examples of what it means to achieve mastery. Even if the reality is mostly warriors sitting in castles, managing paperwork, trying to maintain dignity on stipends that are never quite enough. The 47 Ronin, their story becomes the defining legend of this era, how their lord was forced to commit ritual suicide after being provoked into drawing his sword in the shogun's palace, how his retainers became masterless. Ronin, how they plotted for nearly 2 years, pretending to be dissolute, scattered, forgotten, and then on a winter night they gathered, attacked the mansion of their enemy, took his head, and carried it to their master's grave, knowing that in fulfilling their duty they were signing their own death warrants. And when the shogunate finally ordered them to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, they did so with perfect composure and became immortal, their story told and retold in plays and prints and eventually films, because they embodied the ideal loyalty unto death, the fulfillment of obligation regardless of personal cost, the elevation of duty above life itself, and even now, even centuries later, people visit their graves, leave offerings, honor their memory. The ritual suicide itself becomes codified, formalized into a ceremony with specific requirements. The warrior, dressed in white, seated on white fabric, his final poem composed and read aloud, the short blade drawn across the abdomen in a specific pattern, the assistant standing ready to complete the act with a single stroke that severs the head. And this terrible practice is seen not as barbaric, but as the ultimate expression of self-control, the ability to face death with composure, to transform the moment of dying into art. I think of the preparation required, the mental state necessary to perform this act, and I realize it grows from the same root as the tea ceremony, the same cultivation of presence, the same elimination of everything but the immediate moment, the same aesthetic of simplicity and directness. Death as a performance, yes, but also death as the final statement of a life lived according to principle. The piece continues, generation after generation, and the samurai class begins to struggle with its purpose. They are warriors who do not fight. Their stipends buy less each year as merchants grow wealthy and samurai grow poor. They are forbidden to engage in commerce, forbidden to work with their hands, forbidden to do anything except serve and study and maintain their dignity, and the contradiction grows harder to sustain. Some become teachers, opening schools where they teach swordsmanship or other martial arts to merchants and farmers, something that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Others become scholars, studying Confucian texts, developing elaborate theories of governance and ethics, trying to justify their position in a society that increasingly finds them irrelevant, and still others sink into poverty, into disgrace, selling their swords, abandoning their status, disappearing into the lower classes. But the ideal remains, the image of the perfect warrior, loyal, skilled, cultured, indifferent to death, and this ideal is taught to children, illustrated in books, enacted in theater, becomes part of the national imagination, even as the reality grows more complicated, more compromised, more distant from the heroic age that everyone knows is over. But no one wants to forget. The schools of martial arts proliferate, each claiming to preserve the authentic teachings, each with its own techniques and philosophies, and warriors train in empty rooms with wooden swords, practicing against invisible opponents, perfecting movements that will never be tested in actual combat. And there is something both admirable and tragic in this dedication, this commitment to excellence in something that has no practical purpose, that exists only for its own sake. The relationship with death becomes more philosophical, more abstract, less the immediate reality of the battlefield and more a mental discipline, a way of approaching life by keeping death always in mind, memento mori as daily practice. And the texts written during this period emphasize that every moment might be the last, that the warrior must be ready to die at any instant, that this readiness, this acceptance, paradoxically makes life more vivid, more worth living, and still the cherry blossoms bloom and fall, and still the moon rises over castle walls, and still the tea is whisked in quiet rooms, and the samurai write in their journals about the difficulty of maintaining honor in a world that no longer values what they value, about the challenge of living according to old codes in new circumstances, about the beauty of a life dedicated to something beyond mere survival or comfort or success. The world beyond these islands was changing. Ships from distant countries began appearing with increasing frequency. First the Portuguese and Spanish, then the Dutch and English, bringing firearms and Christianity and new ideas about commerce and governance, and the shogunate responded by closing the country, expelling foreigners, executing Christians, allowing only the most limited trade through a single port, trying to freeze time, to preserve the order they had so carefully constructed. And for a while it worked. The isolation held. Generations passed without significant contact with the outside world. And the samurai continued their rituals, their training, their service to lords who served greater lords in an elaborate hierarchy that ultimately led to the shogun in Edo, the great city that would later be called Tokyo, where hundreds of thousands lived, where the samurais were required to spend alternating years, leaving their families as hostages against rebellion. But the world does not stop. And in the middle of the 19th century, black ships appeared in the harbor, American warships with cannons that could destroy coastal fortifications from a distance the Japanese guns could not match, and the commander demanded that the country open to trade, threatened bombardment if refused, and the shogunate, facing technology they could not counter, agreed to terms that everyone understood meant the end of the old order. I see the confusion of this moment, the realization that everything the samurai had believed about their superiority, their divine protection, their mastery of warfare, was no longer true, that the world had moved on while they practiced with swords, that their elaborate culture of martial discipline was irrelevant against steam engines and rifled artillery, and the question became urgent. What now? What is the purpose of the samurai in this new world? Some argued for resistance, for attacking the foreigners regardless of cost, for maintaining the old ways even unto destruction, and others saw that change was necessary, that Japan must learn from the West, must adopt their technology, their organization, their methods, or be colonized like so much of Asia was being colonized. And this division, this fundamental disagreement about the path forward, led to violence. The country descended into civil war again, samurai fighting samurai, some loyal to the shogun, others to the emperor, but really fighting about whether to embrace modernity or resist it. And the battles were strange hybrid affairs. Men in traditional armor charging Western-style rifle formations, cavalry attacks met with cannon fire, the old ways literally dying in the smoke and chaos. The emperor's faction won, backed ironically by the most progressive elements, the ones most committed to westernization, and they moved the emperor from Kyoto to Edo, renamed the city Tokyo, and began a program of modernization so rapid it still seems astonishing, within a generation transforming from a feudal society to an industrial power, building railroads, factories, a modern army and navy, sending students abroad to learn, inviting foreign experts to teach. And the samurai class was abolished, their stipends ended, their monopoly on martial arts dissolved, their swords banned from public carrying except for ceremonial purposes, and thousands of men who had defined themselves by their status, their lineage, their connection to an ancient warrior tradition, suddenly found themselves adrift, without purpose, without the structure that had given meaning to every aspect of their lives. Some adapted, became officers in the new army, bureaucrats in the modernizing government, businessmen in the emerging economy, teachers in the new schools. They cut their top knots, put on Western clothes, learned to use rifles and write reports and conduct themselves according to new protocols that emphasized efficiency over ceremony, and in doing so, preserved something of the old discipline, the old commitment to duty, even as the forms changed completely. Others could not accept it, saw the changes as betrayal, as the destruction of everything sacred, and there were rebellions, most famously in Satsuma, where thousands of former samurai rose against the government, fought with swords against conscript armies with modern weapons, and were destroyed, the last battle ending with a handful of survivors committing ritual suicide rather than surrender, and this defeat, this final military failure, marked the absolute end of the samurai as a functional class. But something curious happened. Even as the samurai disappeared as a social reality, their image, their ideals, their aesthetics began to spread more widely. The new government promoted Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a national ethic, something all Japanese should aspire to, not just the old warrior class and the values of loyalty, self-discipline, acceptance of hierarchy, willingness to die for a cause. These became part of how the nation understood itself. The martial arts transformed, became ways of self-cultivation rather than practical combat skills. Judo and Kendo developed as sports, as educational disciplines, stripped of their lethal applications but retaining their emphasis on form, on the development of character through physical practice. And these arts spread internationally, became one of Japan's most recognizable cultural exports, a way for people everywhere to touch something of that samurai ideal. I think of the photographs from this transitional period. Men in traditional dress standing stiffly before the camera, swords at their sides, faces serious, formal, and beside them the same men in Western military uniforms or business suits, and the contrast is jarring, shows the violence of the transformation, the speed with which an entire way of life was abandoned, or rather transmuted into something new, something that claimed continuity with the past while being fundamentally different. The swords remained, became art objects, family treasures, symbols of a heritage that could no longer be lousy lived, but could be remembered, honored, preserved in museums and private collections. And the swordsmiths continued their work, no longer making weapons for war, but creating pieces for contemplation, for ceremony, for the preservation of techniques that had been refined over centuries. And in this transformation, the sword became perhaps more purely aesthetic than it had ever been. The literature of this period is full of nostalgia, of samurai remembering their youth, writing memoirs of the old days, of conflicts and loyalties and moments of decision. And these memoirs are tinged with melancholy, with the knowledge that they are describing a world that is gone, that will never return, that exists now only in memory and story. And there is something deeply human in this, the need to record, to testify, to say this is how it was, this is what we believed, this is what we lost. The 20th century brought new transformations, the military rise of Japan, the wars in China and eventually across the Pacific, and the Bushido ideal was conscripted into service, used to motivate soldiers, to justify fanatical resistance, to create a culture where surrender was unthinkable and death in battle was the highest honor, and the samurai values that had once been about personal discipline and aesthetic refinement were twisted into something harder, more absolute, more dangerous. And after defeat, after the atomic bombs and the occupation, there was a reckoning with this heritage, a questioning of these values. Were they responsible for the catastrophe? Had the samurai ideal led the nation into destruction, or had it been corrupted, misused, turned into something it was never meant to be? And these questions did not have simple answers, still do not have simple answers, but the fascination remained, grew, if anything, stronger. The image of the samurai entered global consciousness through films, through martial arts, through a general sense that here was a culture that had achieved something remarkable, a fusion of martial prowess and aesthetic sensitivity, of violence and beauty, of discipline and spontaneity, that seemed to offer a model, or at least a provocation, a way of thinking about honor and duty and the conduct of life. I see now how the story has moved from those early warriors on horseback, rough men in a rough age, through the elaborate refinements of the long peace, the transformation into something like a permanent performance of warrior identity, and then the sudden collapse, the adaptation, the preservation in altered form, and through all of this, through all these changes, something persists, some thread of continuity, some set of questions about how to live, how to face death, how to find meaning in discipline and service. The tea ceremony continued, practiced now by people who have never held a sword, who live in a world of technology and democracy and international commerce, and yet the movements are the same. The attention to detail, the creation of a space apart where what matters is only this moment, this bowl of tea, this gathering of people who will never be together in exactly this way again. The martial arts dojos still teach, still emphasize the perfection of form, the development of character, the respect for tradition, and students bow before beginning practice, perform kata that were old when their great-grandparents were young, and find in this practice something they cannot quite name, some quality of presence, of commitment, of connection to something larger than themselves. And the swords are still forged, still using traditional methods, folding the steel, shaping the curve, creating the hamon, and collectors still prize them, still study them, still see in these objects something more than metal, some embodiment of human striving toward perfection, toward the creation of beauty that is also functional, that serves a purpose even if that purpose is no longer needed. The landscape remains, the mountains and valleys, the rice fields and forests, the temples and shrines, though the castles are mostly gone, destroyed in wars or earthquakes or the simple passage of time. And the cherry blossoms still bloom and fall, still marking the seasons, still reminding anyone who pauses to notice that beauty and impermanence are not opposites, but aspects of the same truth. And yet there is something more to understand, something that goes beyond the historical narrative, beyond the rise and fall of a warrior class, something about the nature of discipline itself, about what it means to dedicate a life to the perfection of form, to the embodiment of principles that may have no practical application, but possess their own strange necessity. I think about the master swordsman standing in an empty dojo, performing a kata he has practiced 10,000 times, and will practice 10,000 more, not because he expects to fight, not because anyone is watching, but because the form itself demands completion, because there is a rightness to the movement when it is executed perfectly, a kind of truth that reveals itself only through endless repetition, through the grinding away of everything extraneous until only the essential remains. This is not about achievement in any ordinary sense, not about winning or losing, not about recognition or reward, but about a relationship with excellence that is almost devotional, the way a monk might approach prayer, the way a calligrapher approaches the stroke of a brush. And in this approach, there is a philosophy, a way of understanding what it means to be human, to have a body, to move through time, to make choices about how to spend the brief years we are given. The tea ceremony master writes that the encounter is once in a lifetime. Ichigos, Ichia, even if the same people gather in the same room tomorrow, it will not be the same, cannot be the same, because time has moved, because we have changed, because this moment, this exact configuration of people and place and light and breath will never occur again. And knowing this, really knowing it, changes how we attend to the present. And this too is part of the samurai inheritance, this awareness of impermanence, this sense that death is always present, not as something morbid or frightening, but as a fact that gives weight to everything, that makes the cherry blossom more beautiful, precisely because it falls, that makes the morning light more precious precisely because evening will come, that makes each encounter significant precisely because it will end. I see the connection between the warrior's readiness for death and the poet's attention to the moment, both arising from the same source, both requiring the same quality of presence. And I understand that the sword and the tea bowl are not opposites, but complementary tools, different ways of engaging with the fundamental questions, different practices leading toward the same realization. There is a story about a famous swordsman who was also a master of tea, and when asked how the two arts related, he said that in both you must give yourself completely to the moment. In both, you must eliminate all thought of before and after. In both, you must act with total commitment while remaining perfectly calm. And the movements of preparing tea, the precise angle of the ladle, the exact pressure of the whisk, these require the same mastery of body and mind as drawing the sword in a single fluid motion that ends a life. The gardens, too, speak this language, the arrangement of rocks that looks natural but is entirely contrived, the pruning of trees to suggest great age or wind-swept exposure, the careful placement of stepping stones to control the pace of walking, to direct attention, to create moments of revelation. And walking through these gardens is itself a meditation, a practice of seeing, of allowing beauty to work on consciousness in ways that bypass explanation. And I realize that what we are approaching here, what all of these practices point toward, is a way of being in the world that is simultaneously fully engaged and completely detached, that acts with total commitment while knowing that all action is provisional, temporary, that the outcome cannot be controlled. And this paradox, this holding of opposites, is perhaps the deepest teaching, the thing that cannot be explained but only experienced through practice. The calligrapher knows that when the brush touches paper, there is no going back, no correction, no second chance. The stroke is either right or it is not. And this irreversibility, this commitment to the moment of action, trains the mind to be ready, to wait for the exact right instant, and then to move without hesitation, without second guessing, with the whole being unified in a single gesture. And is this not how the samurai was supposed to live? Every moment potentially the last, every action carried out with complete attention, with the knowledge that there are no rehearsals, no do-overs, that life happens once, that we are always standing at the brush's tip, at the moment before the stroke, and what we do in that moment reveals everything about who we are. The armor in the museum is beautiful, the lacquered plates laced together with silk cord, the helmet with its fearsome mask, the whole ensemble a work of art that took months to create, and it was worn into battle, was functional protection, but it was also statement, declaration, and insistence that even violence could be conducted with attention to form, to beauty, to the proper way of doing things. And this insistence, this refusal to separate the aesthetic from the practical, seems increasingly rare, increasingly worth preserving, even if only as memory, as possibility. I think of the young person today in Tokyo or New York or Sao Paulo, putting on the hakama, the divided skirt worn for martial arts practice, picking up the wooden sword and bowing before beginning the kata, and in that moment connecting with something that stretches back centuries, embodying a tradition that has survived the end of the society that created it, that persists because it offers us something people need, some counterweight to the acceleration of modern life, some practice of slowness, of attention, of devotion to form, and perhaps this is the final transformation, the samurai becoming not a class but a practice, not a social position but a set of the techniques for cultivating presence, for developing character, for approaching life with seriousness and grace. And in this transformation, something is lost, certainly the organic connection to a living culture, the embeddedness in a total way of life. But something is also preserved, perhaps even strengthened, the essential teaching, the core insight, freed from its original context, and available to anyone willing to undertake the discipline. The moon rises over the valley, just as it did centuries ago, when warriors wrote poems by its light, when they sat in castle towers contemplating impermanence, when they understood themselves to be living between beauty and violence, between the cherry blossom and the blade, and the moon does not care about our interpretations, our longings, our attempts to grasp what cannot be held. It simply rises, crosses the sky, sets, and rises again, and I find myself returning to that image from the beginning, the figure in the courtyard, standing in absolute stillness, and I understand now that this stillness is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but total presence, the gathering of attention into a single point, the unification of body and mind and spirit that precedes action, or that is itself a kind of action, the most fundamental action, the choice to be here, now, completely. The gravel has been raked into patterns that will be disturbed by wind, by rain, by the passage of feet, and tomorrow someone will rake it again, will create the same patterns or slightly different ones. And this is not futile, not Sisyphean, but rather a recognition that order is temporary, that maintenance is continuous, that perfection exists only in the moment of its creation and then begins immediately to decay, and that this decay is not failure, but the nature of things, the way the world works, the truth that must be accepted and worked with rather than denied. The sun is lower now, the shadows longer, and the quality of light has changed, has become softer, more golden, the way it does in late afternoon when the day begins to turn toward evening, and there is a peace in this turning, in the inevitability of it, in the way darkness follows light, follows darkness, in an endless cycle that neither hurries nor delays. I hear, or imagine I hear, the sound of a temple bell, its tone deep and resonant, rolling across the valley, fading slowly into silence, and in that fading there is something complete, something that needs no addition, no elaboration, just the sound, and the silence after the sound, and the awareness that receives both. The path winds down from the mountains, through the forests, past the rice fields, toward the sea, and somewhere on that path, or perhaps beside it, there is a stone marker, weathered by centuries of rain and snow, the characters carved into its surface barely visible, and it marks nothing or everything, a place where someone once paused, looked back, looked forward, and continued walking. And I am walking now, too, in imagination, in memory, in the space between what was and what is, carrying with me all that has been offered, the warriors and the poets, the tea masters and the swordsmiths, the cherry blossoms and the moon, the discipline and the beauty, the codes and the contradictions, all of it settling like snow, layer upon layer, until the shape of something emerges, not complete but suggestive, not finished but present. The wind moves through the pines, a sound like water, like breathing, like the passage of time made audible, and I am listening, just listening, as the day fades, as the story completes itself, as the final words arrange themselves like stones in a garden, like the last stroke of a brush on paper, decisive and irreversible and right. The mist returns to the valley, soft and white and forgiving, covering everything, erasing distinctions, and in this erasure there is rest, there is completion, there is the quiet sense of something finished, not ended but fulfilled, returned to the silence from which it emerged, the same silence that waits beneath all words, all stories, all attempts to capture what moves too quickly to be caught, what lives too fully to be contained. And so, the courtyard empty now, the gravel patterns dissolving in darkness, the figure gone or merged with shadow, and only the mountain remains, and the valley, and the sound of water somewhere in the distance, flowing as it has always flowed, as it will continue to flow, long after these words have faded, long after the story has been forgotten, long after everything we name and treasure has returned to earth, to stone, to the great silence that holds all things. The lamplight falls softly across the old wooden desk, and outside the window the night has settled into that particular kind of stillness that belongs to the hours when most of the world has turned inward, when the hum of the day has faded, and what remains is the quiet company of thought and the gentle pull of curiosity. Tonight there is a story to consider, a story that unfolds not in a single place or a single moment, but across centuries and continents, woven through laboratories and apothecaries, through ancient gardens and modern glass towers, through the careful hands of healers and the restless minds of scientists, all of them seeking the same thing, understanding how the substances we take into our bodies can shift the currents of health and illness, comfort and suffering. This is the world of pharmacology, a word that itself seems to carry a kind of weight, a seriousness, but also a beauty when you let it settle on the tongue. from the Greek pharmakon, meaning drug, or remedy, or even poison, because the ancients understood something we sometimes forget, that the difference between medicine and harm often lives in the smallest of measures, in the delicate calibration of dose and timing and need. And there is something almost meditative about tracing this story backward, peeling away the layers of discovery, finding the threads that connect a modern prescription bottle to a clay tablet pressed with cuneiform, or a chemist's flask to a monk's garden, each connection revealing how human beings have always sought to intervene in the processes of the body, to ease pain, to fight disease, to restore what has been lost. The story begins, as so many stories do, not with a beginning at all, but with a moment suspended in the middle of a much longer arc. Imagine a room, perhaps in Basel, or perhaps in London, or perhaps somewhere you have never been, where light filters through tall windows and falls across shelves lined with glass bottles, each one labeled in careful script. And inside these bottles, powders and tinctures, extracts and compounds, each one the result of countless hours of grinding and mixing, heating and cooling, observing and recording. But before there were these rooms, these laboratories, with their careful measurements and scientific instruments, there were other spaces, older spaces, where knowledge moved differently, passed from teacher to student through demonstration and memory, through stories told beside grinding stones, through the careful cultivation of plants whose properties had been learned through generations of trial and error and sometimes tragedy. The soil holds its secrets well, and the first pharmacologists were those who learned to read the language of roots and leaves, who understood that the bark of one tree might bring down a fever, while the flower of another might ease the racing of an anxious heart, or bring on visions, or stop a heart entirely. And this knowledge was precious, sometimes sacred, always powerful. There is something peaceful about imagining those early gardens, where monks in medieval Europe grew foxglove and mandrake, where Chinese herbalists tended ginseng and ephedra, where Amazonian healers knew the secrets of ayahuasca and curare, each culture developing its own materia medica, its own catalog of remedies, its own understanding of how the natural world could be harnessed to serve human need, and slowly, over centuries, this knowledge began to change shape as alchemy gave way to chemistry, as observation became experimentation, as the question shifted from what does this plant do to why does it do it, and can we isolate the part that works, and can we make it ourselves? The transformation was not sudden. Nothing in science ever is, but rather a gradual brightening, like dawn spreading across a landscape, revealing details that had always been there, but had existed in shadow. And with this brightening came new tools, the microscope, the balance, the distillation apparatus, each one extending human perception into realms that had been invisible before. Tonight, in this quiet hour, we follow that transformation, tracing the path from root to molecule, from garden to laboratory, from empirical knowledge passed down through generations to systematic understanding built up through careful experiment. And in doing so, we find ourselves in the company of those who devoted their lives to this pursuit, who spent years grinding cinchona bark or purifying morphine, who tested compounds on themselves because there was no other way to know, who failed more often than they succeeded, but who gradually, patiently, built the foundation of modern pharmacology. The night deepens outside the window, and the story begins to unfold in earnest, ready to carry us through the long arc of discovery that connects ancient wisdom to contemporary medicine, each chapter revealing another layer, another connection, another moment when human understanding took a step forward into the unknown. The story reaches back further than most people imagine, back beyond the gleaming laboratories and precisely calibrated instruments, back to a time when the boundary between food and medicine was barely a line at all, when survival itself depended on knowing which plants could nourish and which could kill, and which could do something stranger still, could alter pain or consciousness or the course of disease. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, scribes pressed wedges into soft clay tablets, recording recipes that mix the practical with the mystical, instructions for preparing remedies from thyme and mustard, from poppy and mandrake. The Sumerians knew opium, called it hulgil, the plant of joy, and they understood something about its power to transform suffering, even if they could not have explained the chemistry of alkaloids binding to receptors in the brain. The knowledge spread outward, carried along trade routes, adapted and transformed by each culture that encountered it. In Egypt, the Ebers. Papyrus stretched more than 20 meters long, a scroll dating to around 1500 before the Common Era, filled with more than 700 remedies, prescriptions for everything from crocodile bites to baldness, some of them surprisingly effective, others hopelessly entangled with the magic and ritual, but all of them representing an attempt to systematize healing knowledge, to create a pharmacopoeia that could be consulted and taught. And in these ancient texts, you can see the first stirrings of pharmacological thinking, not just this plant helps with that ailment, but attempts to categorize, to understand properties and actions. The Egyptians recognized that some substances cooled while others heated, some dried while others moistened, a framework that seems quaint now, but which represented a genuine effort to find patterns, to build theory from observation. Across the Mediterranean, in the Greek world, this impulse toward systematization found new expression. Hippocrates, whose name would become synonymous with medicine itself, compiled knowledge about hundreds of medicinal plants, but more importantly, he began to ask different questions, not just what works, but how might we understand why it works? What principles might govern the action of remedies on the body? His successor in this endeavor, Dioscorides, was a physician who traveled with Roman armies in the 1st century of the Common Era, and everywhere he went, he collected specimens, interviewed local healers, recorded preparations. His great work, De Materia Medica, described about 600 plants and nearly 1,000 drugs, and it would remain the definitive pharmacological text in Europe for more than 1,500 years, copied and recopied by scribes, translated into Arabic and Syriac and Persian, illustrated with careful drawings of leaves and flowers and roots. What made Dioscorides different, what made his work endure, was his attention to practical detail. He didn't just list plants and their uses. He described how to identify them in the field, when to harvest them, how to prepare and store them. He understood that knowledge was worthless if it couldn't be reliably transmitted and applied, and so he built a framework that could travel across time and space, carrying healing knowledge to generations yet unborn. But the Greeks were doing something else too, something that would prove essential to the future of pharmacology. They were beginning to think about dose, about the relationship between amount and effect. Paracelsus, centuries later, would crystallize this into a principle, but the ancients already intuited the truth that the difference between remedy and poison was often simply a matter of measure. In the East, parallel streams of knowledge were flowing, developing their own sophisticated understandings of how substances affected the body. The great Chinese medical text known as the Shenong Bencao Jing, attributed to the legendary divine farmer, cataloged 365 medicines, categorizing them into superior, medium, and inferior grades, based not on efficacy alone, but on a complex understanding of how they interacted with the body's vital forces, its qi and blood, its heating and cooling energies. The Indian Ayurvedic tradition, equally ancient, developed the concept of Rasa Shastra, the science of mercury and mineral preparations, alongside elaborate classifications of plant medicines. These weren't primitive systems. They were sophisticated frameworks built on centuries of observation, transmission, and refinement, and many of the plants they identified as medicinal have since been validated by modern pharmacology, their traditional uses confirmed by the isolation of active compounds. As the Roman Empire fell and Europe fragmented into smaller kingdoms, much of this knowledge might have been lost, scattered, and forgotten, but it found sanctuary in an unexpected place, in the monasteries, where monks preserved not only religious texts, but also the medical wisdom of the ancients. They created physic gardens, growing medicinal herbs within their walls, and they continued the work of copying manuscripts, including the precious medical texts that contained pharmacological knowledge. These monastic gardens were often laid out with careful attention to symbolism and order, each bed containing plants grouped by property or use. And here, in these quiet, enclosed spaces, generation after generation of monks cultivated their understanding of healing plants, learned to recognize them by leaf and flower, to harvest them at the proper time, to prepare them into tinctures and poultices and decoctions. But the monks were not working in isolation, because by the 8th and 9th centuries, another culture had become the guardian and extender of medical knowledge. The Islamic Golden Age saw an extraordinary flourishing of scientific inquiry, and pharmacy emerged as a distinct discipline, separate from medicine for the first time in history. In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, and Damascus, physicians and pharmacists built on the Greek foundation, but they didn't simply preserve. They innovated. They developed new preparations, syrups and rose water and alcohol distillates. They introduced materia medica from India and China, camphor and senna, musk and tamarind, expanding the pharmacopoeia beyond what the ancients had known. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rahazis, who worked in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, wrote extensively about drug preparation and the importance of using the simplest effective remedy. He tested medicines systematically, documented their effects, distinguished between different preparations of the same substance. He understood that pharmacology required precision, required careful record-keeping, required a scientific mindset. And then there was Ibn Sina. Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the most influential medical text in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. He didn't just list drugs and their uses, he developed theories about how medicines worked, about their primary and secondary qualities, about how they should be combined and prepared. His work represented a genuine attempt at pharmaceutical theory, at understanding the principles that govern drug action. The Islamic pharmacists also did something revolutionary. They established the first private pharmacies, separate from physicians' practices, and they created standards, guidelines for drug preparation and storage, quality control measures. They understood that medicine required not just knowledge, but infrastructure systems to ensure that remedies were prepared consistently and safely. This knowledge flowed back into Europe through multiple channels, through the medical school at Salerno in Italy, where Arabic texts were translated into Latin, through the courts of Sicily and Spain, where Islamic and Christian scholars worked side by side, and gradually, European medicine began to absorb this richer, more sophisticated understanding of drugs and their preparation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, apothecaries were emerging as a distinct profession in European cities. Their shops became recognizable features of urban life, with their distinctive mortars and pestles, their rows of jars and bottles, their scales for weighing ingredients. These weren't just stores, they were repositories of knowledge, places where the art of drug preparation was practiced and refined. The apothecaries developed their own guild structures, their own systems of apprenticeship. A young person might spend 7 years learning the trade, memorizing hundreds of plant names and their properties, learning to compound medicines according to traditional formulas, mastering the delicate arts of extraction and preservation. It was craft knowledge passed down through demonstration and practice, knowledge that lived in the hands as much as in books. And slowly, very slowly, this craft was beginning to encounter something new, the stirrings of what would become experimental science, the idea that you could test, could compare, could measure and quantify, the idea that tradition, while valuable, wasn't sacred, that old knowledge could be questioned and improved upon. The 16th century brought Paracelsus, a figure so controversial that arguments about his legacy continue today. A physician who rejected much of the Galenic tradition that had dominated medicine for more than 1,000 years, who insisted that chemistry, not just herbalism, was the key to understanding drugs, who declared that all things are poison and nothing is without poison. Only the dose permits something not to be poisonous, a principle that would become foundational to pharmacology. Paracelsus was abrasive, confrontational. He burned Avicenna's canon in public, scandalized his colleagues, and yet, beneath the bombast, he was pointing toward something important, toward the idea that medicines didn't work through mystical qualities, but through their chemical nature. That understanding, this nature required investigation, experimentation, measurement. He introduced mineral medicines, preparations of mercury and antimony and sulfur, some of them genuinely useful, others dangerous. He believed that the body contained an inner alchemist that transformed substance. And while his theoretical framework was wrong, his emphasis on chemistry as the foundation of drug action pointed in a direction that would eventually prove fruitful. The 17th century saw these various threads beginning to weave together: the herbalist tradition, the chemical approach, the emerging experimental method, and slowly, without anyone quite realizing it was happening, pharmacy was beginning its transformation into pharmacology, from an art based on tradition and authority to a science based on investigation and evidence. The change would take centuries to complete, but the first steps were being taken, tentative, uncertain, but pointing forward into a future where understanding would replace mystery, where mechanism would illuminate effect. The transformation began in earnest with a substance that had been known for millennia, but never truly understood. Opium, the dried latex of the poppy, had been used since ancient times, but in the early 19th century, a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner decided to investigate what made it work, what gave it its power to ease pain and induce stupor. Working alone in his apothecary, with equipment he built himself, Serturner extracted a crystalline substance from opium, something pure and potent. He tested it on stray dogs, then on himself and 3 young friends, to a reckless experiment that nearly killed them all, but which proved beyond doubt that he had isolated the active principle, the molecule responsible for opium's effects. He called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was the breakthrough that changed everything, because if you could isolate the active ingredient, you could standardize the dose. You could understand the structure. You could begin to ask why it worked the way it did. Morphine became the first alkaloid ever purified from a plant, the first time a pure chemical compound had been identified as the source of a drug's action, and suddenly a new kind of investigation became possible. Others followed Serturner's path. Chemists began extracting and purifying active compounds from traditional medicines, strychnine from Nux vomica, quinine from cinchona bark, atropine from deadly nightshade. Each isolation was a revelation, showing that plants didn't work through vague qualities or mystical essences, but through specific molecules with specific structures, molecules that could be weighed and measured, studied and modified. The extraction of quinine was particularly significant because malaria was one of the great killers of the age, and cinchona bark, brought from South America, was the only effective treatment, but the bark was variable in potency, difficult to dose, sometimes ineffective. When Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Bien-Aimé Caventou isolated pure quinine in 1820, they gave physicians a tool of unprecedented reliability, a white crystalline powder that could be measured precisely, that worked predictably, that saved countless lives. And slowly, through the middle decades of the 19th century, the work continued, each new isolation expanding the catalog of pure drugs, each one representing hours of painstaking work, grinding and dissolving, heating and filtering, crystallizing and recrystallizing, until what remained was a substance of such purity that its properties could be studied with scientific precision. But isolation was only the beginning, because once you had a pure compound, you could begin to ask deeper questions. What was its chemical structure? How did it interact with the body? Could you modify it to make it more effective or less toxic? And answering these questions required new tools, new techniques, new ways of thinking about the relationship between molecular structure and biological effect. The development of organic chemistry in the mid-1800s provided those tools. Chemists learned to determine molecular formulas, to understand how atoms bonded together, to recognize functional groups that conferred particular properties, and gradually they began to see patterns, that certain structural features tended to produce certain physiological effects, that small changes in molecular architecture could dramatically alter a drug's action. This understanding led to the birth of medicinal chemistry, the deliberate modification of natural compounds to enhance their therapeutic properties. One of the first triumphs came with the synthesis of aspirin, the biochemist Felix Hoffmann, seeking a better treatment for his father's arthritis, modified salicylic acid, a compound derived from willow bark, by adding an acetyl group. The result was acetyl salicylic acid, less irritating to the stomach, more tolerable, more effective. A drug that would become one of the most widely used medicines in history. But Hoffmann's work on aspirin was almost an afterthought, because what Bayer really wanted was a better cough suppressant, and just days after synthesizing aspirin, Hoffmann modified morphine, creating diacetylmorphine, a compound the company would market as heroin, believing it to be a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine, a catastrophic misjudgment that would haunt medicine for generations, and which illustrated the double-edged nature of pharmaceutical innovation, that the power to heal and the power to harm often resided in the same molecule, separated only by dose or circumstance or understanding. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, pharmacology was establishing itself as a scientific discipline, distinct from both pharmacy and medicine. The German physiologist Oswald Schmiedeberg, working in Strasbourg, created the first true pharmacology department, training a generation of researchers who would spread across Europe and America, establishing programs, building laboratories, defining the methods and questions that would shape the field. These early pharmacologists asked fundamental questions about how drugs worked, how they were absorbed and distributed through the body, how they were metabolized and excreted, how their effects varied with dose and route of administration. They developed techniques to measure drug concentrations in blood and tissues, to track their movement through the body, to correlate dose with effect in quantitative ways. One of the most important insights came from understanding receptors. The idea that drugs didn't work by some general action on tissues, but by binding to specific molecular targets, sites that recognized certain chemical structures. Paul Ehrlich, working in the early 1900s, proposed the concept of chemotherapy, the idea that you could find or design molecules that would target disease-causing organisms while sparing healthy tissue. He called it the magic bullet approach, and spent years testing compound after compound, seeking molecules that would kill trypanosomes or spirochetes without poisoning the patient. His work was tedious, methodical. Compound number 606 proved effective against syphilis, but only after testing 605 failures. This was the new reality of drug discovery, not serendipitous findings in nature, but systematic chemical synthesis and biological testing, screening hundreds or thousands of compounds to find one that worked, a process that required patience, resources, and an almost industrial approach to research. The early 20th century also saw growing awareness that drugs needed regulation, that the marketplace couldn't be trusted to ensure safety or efficacy. Too many patent medicines contained dangerous substances, made fraudulent claims, harmed the people who took them in America. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 began to impose standards, but it would take tragedies to drive real reform. The sulfanilamide disaster of 1937, when more than 100 people died from a preparation that used diethylene glycol as a solvent, led to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which required safety testing before drugs could be marketed, and the thalidomide tragedy of the early 1960s, when a drug marketed as a safe sedative for pregnant women caused severe birth defects in thousands of children, led to requirements for proof of efficacy, not just safety. These regulations transformed drug development, making it longer, more expensive, more rigorous, but also more reliable. Companies now had to conduct systematic studies, gather data, prove their claims. Pharmacology became inseparable from clinical trials and statistical analysis, from toxicology and drug metabolism studies, from understanding not just whether a drug worked, but how it worked, how the body handled it, what happened when it was given to different populations under different conditions. Meanwhile, the science itself was advancing on multiple fronts. The discovery of neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carried signals between nerve cells, opened up entirely new ways of thinking about drug action. If acetylcholine or norepinephrine or serotonin mediated specific functions, then drugs that mimicked or blocked these molecules could produce highly targeted effects. This understanding led to the development of beta blockers for heart disease. SSR is for depression, dopamine antagonists for schizophrenia, each class of drugs emerging from a deepening understanding of how the nervous system functioned at the molecular level. The post-war period saw an explosion of pharmaceutical innovation. Antibiotics, discovered somewhat serendipitously by Alexander Fleming, but developed into practical medicines through the systematic work of Florey and Chain and the industrial might of wartime production, revolutionized the treatment of bacterial infections. Diseases that had killed millions could now be cured with a few pills or injections. It seemed like a golden age, when every year brought new drugs, new cures, new possibilities. But the process of discovery was becoming more sophisticated, more deliberately engineered. Chemists were learning to design molecules with specific properties to predict how structural modifications would affect activity, to optimize compounds for better absorption, longer duration, fewer side effects, the advent of high-throughput screening using automated systems to test thousands of compounds against biological targets, accelerated the pace of discovery even further. And beneath all this practical work, theoretical understanding was deepening. Pharmacokinetics, the study of what the body does to a drug, became a quantitative science with mathematical models describing absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, pharmacodynamics. The study of what a drug does to the body developed increasingly sophisticated models of dose-response relationships, of receptor-binding kinetics, of signal transduction pathways. The molecular biology revolution of the late 20th century opened yet another dimension. Suddenly researchers could clone genes, express proteins, determine three-dimensional structures of drug targets. This wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. Because if you could see the exact shape of a receptor or enzyme, you could design molecules to fit it, like crafting a key for a specific lock. Computational chemistry and molecular modeling became essential tools, allowing researchers to test millions of theoretical compounds in silico before ever synthesizing one in the laboratory. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, promised to accelerate this process even further, revealing thousands of potential drug targets, genes that when mutated caused disease, proteins that when blocked or activated might restore health. Pharmacogenomics emerged, the study of how genetic variation affects drug response, recognizing that the same drug might work differently in different people depending on their genetic makeup. That personalized medicine tailored to individual biology might be possible through all these changes from the isolation of morphine to the design of monoclonal antibodies, from herbal decoctions to gene therapies. The fundamental questions remain the same. How do we find substances that can modify disease? How do we make them safe and effective? How do we understand their actions well enough to predict their effects, to minimize their harms, to use them wisely? And the answers kept evolving, growing more sophisticated, more nuanced, revealing layer after layer of complexity in the relationship between chemistry and biology, between molecule and organism, between dose and response. The late 20th century brought both triumph and reckoning as pharmacology matured into a discipline of extraordinary sophistication, capable of designing molecules atom by atom, yet facing challenges that no amount of technical prowess could fully resolve. The laboratory bench gave way to the clinical trial, and the clinical trial revealed complexities that pure chemistry could never capture. The messiness of human biology, the variability of response, the unexpected consequences that emerged when theory met reality. The development of HIV antiretrovirals stands as perhaps the defining pharmaceutical achievement of the era. When AIDS emerged in the early 1980s, it seemed like a death sentence, inexorable, terrifying. Within a few years, researchers had identified the virus, understood its life cycle, pinpointed the enzymes it needed to replicate, and then, with remarkable speed, they designed molecules to inhibit those enzymes, AZT protease inhibitors, reverse transcriptase inhibitors, each one targeting a specific step in the viral life cycle. But the real breakthrough came from combination therapy, using multiple drugs simultaneously, attacking the virus at different points, preventing it from developing resistance. What had been a fatal diagnosis became a manageable chronic condition. People who would have died lived. The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that it vindicated the entire enterprise of rational drug design, showed what was possible when deep biological understanding met sophisticated chemistry. Yet even this success revealed limitations. The drugs were expensive, beyond the reach of millions who needed them. They required strict adherence to complex regimens. They produced side effects that could be severe. And they didn't cure the disease, only suppressed it, requiring lifelong treatment, raising questions about access, about sustainability, about whether pharmaceutical innovation alone could solve global health challenges. These questions grew more pressing as the pharmaceutical industry itself transformed. The small family-owned firms and university spin-offs that had dominated the early 20th century gave way to massive multinational corporations, companies with revenues larger than many nations, with research budgets in the billions, with marketing arms that sometimes seemed to dwarf their scientific operations. The economics of drug development had become staggering. Bringing a new compound from laboratory to market could take 15 years and cost more than $1 billion, and the vast majority of candidates failed, never made it to approval, represented investments that would never be recouped. This economic reality shaped which diseases were studied and which were ignored. Companies focused on conditions that affected wealthy populations. Chronic diseases requiring long-term treatment, cancer and heart disease and diabetes, while neglected tropical diseases, affecting hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people, received minimal attention. The free market, left to itself, didn't allocate research toward the greatest medical need, but toward the greatest profit potential, a tension that would define pharmaceutical policy debates for decades. The rise of biologics, drugs derived from living organisms rather than chemical synthesis, added another layer of complexity. Monoclonal antibodies, proteins, engineered to bind specific targets with exquisite precision, proved remarkably effective for conditions from cancer to autoimmune disease. But they were difficult and expensive to manufacture, requiring vast bioreactors, complex purification processes, careful quality control. They couldn't be taken as pills, had to be injected or infused, and cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, creating treatments of unprecedented effectiveness but limited accessibility. At the same time, a darker story was unfolding around opioid medications. Pharmaceutical companies had developed new formulations of old drugs, extended-release preparations of oxycodone and hydromorphone, marketed with claims of reduced addiction risk that turned out to be tragically false. Aggressive promotion, coupled with inadequate physician education and lax prescribing practices, fueled an epidemic of addiction and overdose death that devastated communities across North America. A stark reminder that pharmacology's power to heal came with an equal power to harm, and that commercial interests didn't always align with public health. The opioid crisis prompted soul-searching about the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and medicine, about the role of marketing in drug prescribing, about whether the profit motive was compatible with the careful, conservative approach that powerful drugs required. It revealed how even well-intentioned physicians could be influenced by misleading information, how patients seeking relief from legitimate pain could become trapped in addiction, how the same molecules that had been saving lives for 2 centuries could, when misused or overprescribed, destroy them. Meanwhile, the science continued advancing. Pharmacology was merging with fields that hadn't existed a generation earlier, with genomics and proteomics, with systems biology and computational modeling, with nanotechnology and tissue engineering. Researchers could now edit genes with CRISPR, could design nanoparticles to deliver drugs to specific cell types, could grow organoids in culture to test drug effects in something approaching real tissue. The tools had become almost science-fictional in their sophistication, yet fundamental challenges remained. The brain was still largely a mystery. Psychiatric medications worked, more or less for some people, but understanding why, or why they failed for others, remained elusive. Alzheimer's disease, despite decades of research and billions invested, had no effective treatment. Candidate drugs failed trial after trial, revealing how much was still unknown about neurodegeneration, about the cascade of events that led from healthy brain to dementia. Cancer treatment had advanced dramatically, but most cancers still couldn't be cured, only managed, pushed back, held at bay for a time. The COVID-19 pandemic brought both vindication and revelation. The development of effective vaccines in less than a year using novel mRNA technology represented an almost miraculous achievement, pharmacology and immunology working together, enabled by decades of basic research, by massive investment, by regulatory flexibility, by global cooperation. It showed what was possible when the usual constraints were loosened, when urgency overrode caution, when resources flowed freely toward a single goal. But the pandemic also exposed inequities. How vaccines reached wealthy nations first while poorer countries waited. How misinformation could undermine public health efforts. How political considerations could distort scientific discourse. How the infrastructure for drug development and distribution was deeply uneven, concentrated in certain regions, inaccessible to much of the world. These weren't new problems, but the pandemic made them impossible to ignore. And as the field moved into the 21st century, certain patterns became clear. Pharmacology had grown from a craft into a science, from observation and trial into rational design and systematic investigation. It had produced drugs that prevented or cured diseases that once killed millions, that eased suffering on a scale that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. But it had also created new problems: antibiotic resistance from overuse, addiction epidemics from overprescription, environmental contamination from pharmaceutical waste, health inequities from market-driven research priorities. The relationship between pharmacology and society had become impossibly tangled. Drugs were simultaneously life-saving medicines and commodities, tools of healing and sources of profit, objects of rigorous scientific study and targets of aggressive marketing. They were regulated by governments but developed by corporations, tested in clinical trials but prescribed based on clinical judgment and patient preference and insurance coverage. They embodied both the best of human ingenuity and some of the most intractable problems of modern capitalism. Young researchers entering the field now face choices their predecessors never had to consider: whether to work in academia or industry, whether to focus on basic science or applied research, whether to study diseases affecting millions or rare conditions affecting hundreds, whether to work on drugs that might reach market or on fundamental questions that might never have practical application. And underlying all these choices, questions about what pharmacology was for, about who it served, about what obligations came with the power to intervene in human biology at the molecular level. The tools had become extraordinary. Molecular dynamics simulations that could predict how drugs would bind to targets, high-throughput screening that could test millions of compounds, artificial intelligence that could identify patterns in vast data sets, suggest new drug candidates, predict side effects. But tools alone didn't answer the fundamental questions. Which diseases should be prioritized? How should drugs be priced? Who should have access? How should risks and benefits be weighed? How much precaution was appropriate before releasing a new drug? How to balance innovation with safety, speed with thoroughness. And perhaps this was the real story of modern pharmacology. Not just the accumulation of knowledge and technique, but the growing awareness of complexity, of how much remained unknown, of how intervening in biological systems always produced unexpected consequences, of how social and economic structures shaped which questions got asked and which answers got pursued, the field had gained immense power, but with that power came responsibility, came uncertainty, came the need for humility in the face of biological complexity and social consequences that couldn't be fully predicted or controlled. The night outside has deepened further, and the story has traced its arc from ancient gardens to modern laboratories, from empirical observation to molecular design, from simple remedies to sophisticated interventions, and now, having followed this long thread through time, it becomes possible to step back, to consider not just the history, but what it means, what it reveals about the human relationship with nature and with our own biology, about the possibilities and limits of understanding, about what we gain and what we risk when we reach for the power to alter life at its most fundamental levels. The deepening quiet of this hour invites a different kind of consideration, not the chronological unfolding of events, but something more lateral, more wandering, the kind of thinking that happens when the mind is allowed to drift across connections that don't announce themselves in daylight, when patterns emerge that the focused analytical gaze might miss. Consider the strange intimacy of pharmacology, how it represents perhaps the most direct intervention one organism can make into the workings of another, a molecule shaped by chemists or extracted from plants, crossing membranes, entering cells, binding to receptors, altering the cascade of signals that constitute sensation and thought and bodily function. There is something almost invasive about it, and yet also something tender, this desire to ease suffering, to restore function, to give the body what it needs to heal itself. Every drug tells a story about boundaries, about where one thing ends and another begins. The pharmaceutical chemist designs a molecule that will slip past the body's defenses, cross the blood-brain barrier or the intestinal wall, reach its target despite all the systems evolved to keep foreign substances out. It's a kind of biochemical lockpicking, elegant and transgressive at once, finding the gaps in cellular architecture, exploiting the porosity that makes life possible, but also vulnerable. And there is poetry in the names themselves, words that accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer of meaning, morphine from Morpheus, atropine from Atropos, one of the three fates who cuts the thread of life, appropriate for a substance derived from deadly nightshade that can dilate pupils or stop a heart, depending on dose, or considered digitalis, from the Latin for finger, because the flowers of foxglove look like fingertips, a plant that strengthens the failing heart, that contains molecules so perfectly shaped to bind sodium-potassium pumps that they might have been designed for the purpose, though of course they weren't. They evolved for reasons having nothing to do with human hearts, and we simply learn to exploit them. This is one of the deeper mysteries. Why plant alkaloids and animal receptors fit together at all? Why molecules that evolved in completely separate lineages for completely different purposes should interact so specifically? Opium poppies didn't evolve morphine to ease human pain. They evolved it as a defense against herbivores, as a chemical weapon, and yet by chance or by some deeper principle of chemistry, these molecules happen to fit receptors in the human brain that normally bind endorphins, our own internal opioids, the body's natural analgesics. It suggests that there are only so many ways to build a molecule that does a particular kind of chemical work, that the space of possible structures is vast but not infinite, that nature explores the same solutions repeatedly, finding the shapes that work, the configurations that bind, the architectures that produce effect. And pharmacology is in some sense the study of this chemical space, mapping the relationships between structure and function, between shape and effect, between what a molecule is and what it does. The history of drug discovery is filled with accidents, with substances found while looking for something else. Penicillin discovered in contaminated cultures. LSD synthesized in a search for respiratory stimulants. Sildenafil developed for angina but found to have more marketable effects. These serendipitous findings suggest that we still don't fully understand the mapping between molecular structure and biological activity, that there are still surprises waiting, effects we haven't predicted, uses we haven't imagined, but there is also something unsettling in this, the recognition that every drug is a kind of promiscuous molecule, that it never binds to just one target, never produces just one effect. The desired action is always accompanied by off-target effects, by interactions we didn't intend and sometimes don't discover until after years of widespread use. The body is not a collection of isolated systems, but a web of feedback loops and cascades, and pulling on one thread always disturbs others. This is why side effects are inevitable, why every drug is a negotiation between benefit and harm, why the package insert listing adverse reactions runs for pages. The more potent the drug, the more specifically it acts, the more carefully it must be used, the narrower the window between therapeutic and toxic dose. Some drugs, like lithium for bipolar disorder or warfarin for blood clots, require regular monitoring, blood tests to ensure the level stays within the narrow range where it helps without harming. A reminder that pharmacology is always a balancing act, always walking a line between too little and too much, and beneath all the science, all the molecular models and clinical trials and regulatory frameworks, there remains something ancient, something that connects modern pharmacology to the first human who chewed willow bark for pain or brewed poppy tea for sleep. The fundamental recognition that the world contains substances that can alter our experience, that can change how we feel, how we think, how our bodies function. This knowledge is both powerful and dangerous, and every culture has had to develop ways of managing it, of deciding who can access these substances, under what circumstances, with what safeguards. The regulation of drugs is ultimately about managing this power, about trying to ensure that the benefits outweigh the harms, that those who prescribe understand what they're prescribing, that those who take drugs know what they're taking. But it's also about control, about who gets to decide what substances are medicine and what are contraband, what's therapy and what's enhancement, what's treatment and what's recreation. These boundaries are not natural. They're cultural, historical. They shift over time and differ across societies. Consider how cannabis, used medicinally for thousands of years, became illegal in much of the world in the 20th century and is now being re-legalized, reclassified as medicine again, or how amphetamines, once sold over the counter, became controlled substances, but are still prescribed to millions of children for attention deficit disorder. The same molecule can be medicine or drug of abuse, depending on context, on who's taking it and why, on whether a doctor has authorized it, on cultural attitudes and political decisions. This reveals something important about pharmacology, that it's never just about molecules, never purely scientific. It's always embedded in social structures, in economic systems, in cultural beliefs about health and disease, about normalcy and deviation, about what kinds of alteration are acceptable and what kinds are transgression. The sleeping pill is medicine, but the party drug is vice. Even when they're chemically similar, even when they work through the same mechanisms, and there is something almost philosophical about the very idea of pharmacological intervention, the assumption that we can and should modify our biology, that the states our bodies naturally fall into are not necessarily the states they should be in, that chemistry can correct, can optimize, can restore, or even enhance. It's a peculiar form of dualism, treating the body as a machine that can be adjusted, tuned, repaired with the right chemical tools. Yet we are not separate from our chemistry, consciousness itself. Emotion, memory, everything we call the mind emerges from the same molecular interactions that drugs manipulate. There is no ghost in the machine, only the machine, chemistry all the way down. And if that's true, then every thought, every feeling, every decision is already the product of molecules binding to receptors, of neurotransmitters crossing synapses, of ion channels opening and closing. Drugs don't introduce chemistry into an otherwise non-chemical system. They just alter the chemistry that was already there, shift the balances, change the concentrations, modify the ongoing molecular dance that constitutes being alive. This is both humbling and strange, to recognize that the self we experience as continuous and coherent is actually a pattern maintained by countless chemical reactions, that a few milligrams of the right substance can shift mood or perception or personality, that who we are is less fixed than we imagine, more dependent on molecular details, more contingent. It suggests that the boundary between self and substance is porous, that we are already always under the influence of hormones and neurotransmitters, of the chemicals our own bodies produce, and that pharmaceutical drugs are just another input into this ongoing process. The story comes full circle then, back to the beginning, to the recognition that humans have always known that certain substances could change experience, could ease suffering or induce visions, could heal or harm. What has changed is not this fundamental knowledge, but the sophistication of our understanding, the precision of our tools, the depth of our insight into mechanism. We have traded mystery for complexity, magic for pharmacokinetics, but the essential relationship remains between organism and substance, between biology and chemistry, between the desire to intervene and the effects of intervention. And so the lamplight still falls across the desk, and the night is still deep. But the story has traced its path from ancient gardens to molecular models, from empirical wisdom to rational design, from the first tentative observations that certain plants had certain effects, to a science capable of designing molecules atom by atom, predicting their actions, optimizing their properties, manufacturing them in vast quantities, distributing them globally, regulating their use through elaborate legal and medical frameworks. The transformation has been extraordinary, And yet, in this quiet hour, for it's worth noting what remains mysterious, how much is still unknown, how many diseases have no treatment, how many drugs work without anyone fully understanding why, how the brain remains largely opaque, how individual variation means that what works for one person fails for another, how the placebo effect reminds us that belief itself has biochemical consequences, that the mind and body are not separate systems, but aspects of a single unified process. The future of pharmacology will bring new tools, new insights, new possibilities, gene therapies and RNA drugs, personalized medicine tailored to individual genetics, artificial intelligence designing molecules no human chemist would imagine, but it will also bring new challenges, new ethical dilemmas, new questions about access and equity, about enhancement versus treatment, about the limits of intervention, about what we want pharmacology to be and do, about what kind of relationship we want with our own biology. And perhaps that is enough to have traced this long arc, to have followed the thread from root to molecule, from observation to understanding, from craft to science, to have seen both the triumphs and the tragedies, the lives saved and the harms caused, the knowledge gained and the mysteries that remain. The story of pharmacology is not finished. It continues, evolving, branching, revealing new complexities even as it solves old problems. But for now, in this moment, the telling can rest. The night deepens into that hour when thought becomes diffuse, when the boundaries of attention soften, when the mind begins to drift toward other states. The story has been told, the arc completed, and what remains is simply the quiet, the stillness, the gentle fade of consciousness toward whatever comes next. Outside the window, the world continues its slow turning, and somewhere in laboratories and hospitals, in pharmacies and research institutes, the work goes on, molecules being synthesized, trials being conducted, patients being treated, the great ongoing experiment of pharmacology, of trying to understand and harness chemistry in service of health, of easing suffering, of extending life, of intervening in the molecular processes that constitute being alive. But here, in this room, in this moment, there is only the lamplight and the page and the gathering silence, the story settling into memory, joining all the other stories that make up understanding, that constitute knowledge, that connect past to present, that illuminate the long human effort to comprehend and shape the world. The words slow, the sentences stretch, the thoughts disperse like smoke, and what began with questions, with curiosity, with the desire to trace a path through history, ends with quiet, with stillness, with the simple presence of this moment, this breath, this fading awareness of the lamp, the desk, the night beyond the window, and then nothing more needs saying. The story is complete, the telling done, and all that remains is the gentle dissolution into silence, into rest, into the wordless space where stories end and something else begins, something that doesn't need narration, that simply is quiet, still, complete.